All right, guys, what's going on? This is the introduction for YouTube. Twitch doesn't need this introduction. I'm not sure when this is going to come up on YouTube. Probably not for a couple of days, so Twitch gets the sneak peek. As we've done with the past couple of expansions, we are going to go back and do a review of my review. We're going to take a look at where I could potentially have gone wrong in terms of judging specific cards, why I went wrong, and what to learn for the future. And we'll maybe take a look on how right I was, because, spoiler alert, I ended up being pretty correct on most of the stuff, which feels good because it doesn't always happen. For the past few expansions, I've done pretty well, I think, on judging cards. But if you go back to Houses of Morrowind, I did pretty dang poorly. So I will take my wins where I can get them, but let's go ahead and get started. Let's just go ahead. I'll explain the... I got to take my face off the screen and I'll explain the rating system. This is pretty much it. There's not a ton of difference between 1 and 2 star cards. The only difference is amount of times that you see them. We have 1 star sees no play, 2 star saw some experimentation or sees some very light play, but is not significantly better than a 1 star card. And then you see these are kind of broad guidelines. They're not very specific. You can kind of, if something fits into this, you can make an argument for it to be a little bit higher. But for a broad guideline, a 3-star card is in a tier 3 deck or sees scattered play within tier 2 decks. A 4-star card is in a tier 2 deck, pushes a tier 3 deck to the point where it's the only reason that it's tier 3 or sees scattered play in a tier 1 deck. And then 5-star is in a tier 1 deck. It's all it's got to be. It's got to be a staple in a tier 1 deck, or it pushes a tier 2 deck to become is the only reason that is in tier 2 versus a lower tier. So we're going to skip ahead. I did some introductions here about the mechanics and stuff, but we're just going to start with the hyper crap that Red got. RDSK with the follow. Thank you, buddy.
All right, and one last disclaimer before I start. Given what happened with Alliance 4, I'm trying to change up a little bit on my review style. I'm trying to, when I have a bad feeling about a card or when I feel like a card is not very good, I'm trying to be more aggressive about whether or not I'll rate it a 1 or a 2-star. There was a lot of cards in Alliance 4 that I talked about as if they were very bad and then ended up rating them 3 stars or 4 stars or something like that. I'm trying to do that less, so trying to make my thoughts match my ratings a little bit more. And we'd bring up this disclaimer because Devouring Flame I'm going to be calling a 1-star card. Now, I think this is going to see maybe a little bit of play at the start of the expansion as people kind of try it as a 2-mana firebolt, but I think the banish effect is so minor that you're really not going to see this very much. I don't think this fits into any deck. I don't think the extra mana for 1 more damage and not drawing a card compared to Rapid Shot is even remotely worth it. I think this is definitely something that people might try just because it has the word banish on it, but I think the power level on this is very, very low. 2-mana deal 2 is just really, really bad right now, considering Firebolt is not even seeing a whole lot of play.
Yeah, there's not too much to say on that one. Devouring Flame is really bad. Banish isn't that good of an effect. Legitimately, you could see this card see some play. If this was deal 3 damage and banish a creature at 3 mana, you might have seen it in this past meta as a way to deal with Elfiq, but it's just bad in its current state.
Is super interesting. I really, really like this card. This has a lot of potential applications. Like most of these, I tend towards it being a control card just because I see a lot of more potential in control as something that could maybe let you double up on a very good summon effect while also being something that kind of keeps your opponent at bay. Just a really, really versatile card. The fact that it has Prophecy is a huge upside. I think this potentially pushes some red control decks, specifically Redoran, which I think has been struggling for a while. Something like this is basically a better Knight to remember, and Redoran just allows them to keep up on tempo a little bit easier in the mid game, which is where they really struggle. So really excited about this one. I think this fits into a lot of control archetypes and potentially some aggro archetypes as well. It's just because you have the ability to double up on chargers like Cliff Racer.
Yeah, Fear Totem definitely still has potential. Like, no question, the card still has potential, but at the moment it hasn't found a home. This is a 2-star card. It saw a ton of experimentation and a lot of different stuff like Market, stuff like anything in control, Prophecy Battle Mage. It kind of stuck in Prophecy Battle Mage. People still use it there, but I don't think that's even a tier 3 deck, so Fear Totem is a 2-star card on reflection, but definitely one that has a lot of potential moving forward. If we see some of the slower aspects of control come back, which maybe we will now that we have Crabscription, so some of the slow remove everything styles of control might, be working their way back into the meta. I think Fear Totem fits into those pretty well, but as of right now, it just doesn't really have a home. So yeah, that's a 2-star card.
3/2s are just is going to be a 2-star card. I think people are definitely going to attempt this in red-based aggro decks, but I don't think it will stick there. I think generally there's just a big issue with how low impact a 2-mana 3/2 is. I think 2-mana 3/2s are just too often eaten alive by stuff like Wardcrafter or some of the other cards that we're going to see in this set. I think the fact that you give it a Steel Dagger is nice, and the fact that you can equip that to whatever you'd like is also nice, but I think Pilfer is an effect that is very difficult to rate highly unless the Pilfer is very good. When you compare this to something like Daring Cutpurse, you get one more attack stat, but instead of +1/+1, you get +1/+0. I think that's worse. You also have Prophecy on the Daring Cutpurse. Daring Cutpurse is not a card that sees a lot of play, and I think it's significantly better than this card, so...
All right, Prowl Smuggler is a 3-star card. Does end up being a little bit better than Daring Cutpurse, specifically because Daring Cutpurse can't be played in Battle Mage. I think that's where this ended up finding most of the home. In aggressive versions of Battle Mage, utilizing stuff like Altmer Flameslinger and Wardcrafter, obviously, even Scroll Seeker in some aspects. I think aggro BM is kind of on the border of tier 3, tier 2. It's not really played enough to be tier 2, but it's definitely a powerful deck. I also think you see scattered play in various other tier 3 decks, so I think this is a pretty solid 3-star card, maybe on the border of being 4, but I don't think it's quite there just because the decks it's in don't get enough representation. But yeah, the synergy with Ward ended up pushing this over something like Daring Cutpurse. So basically, we've seen this mostly in Battle Mage, although you see it like a little bit in Archer and a couple other things. But definitely a solid card, not one that's really lighting the world on fire, but good enough to see play anywhere.
Similar story for your Axial Berserker. I think the big issue with this is that this is an aggro card that unfortunately can't be reliably played on turn 2. This is a 3-mana card. So if you have Ring, when you think about something like Young Mammoth, Ring Mammoth is the reason you play Mammoth. If you weren't able to play it on turn 2 sometimes, you probably wouldn't be playing it in your deck. The fact that this is very, very rarely going to be coming down on turn 2 with the Ring as a 4/4 is such a huge deal. There's not enough upside in a 3-mana 4/4 that you can risk not being able to play it on turn 2 or turn 3 when you need it the most. So I think this is just not consistent enough compared to other options, even in red like Blighted Aylet or Doomfang Ally. So I think this is just not going to be good enough. People will attempt it because it is potentially a 3-mana 4/4, but I think it will fall off.
Your Axial Berserker sucks. It's a 1-star card. Didn't even really see play in the consume decks when people were trying that. So yeah, your Axial Berserker is really bad. The fact that you can't ring it out means it's terrible.
Imbued Minotaur just unfortunately isn't bulky enough to make the cut. I think specifically the same cards I just mentioned, Doomfang Ally and Blighted Aylet, I think are just better cards than this. Even though this does have some potential with other being consumed by other things early on the curve, especially because there is some aggro consumed cards and mid-range consumed cards. We saw a decent amount of those. I don't think any of those are good enough to justify running a 3-mana 5/2 in the deck, considering Negation's still around, Firebolt's still around, Wardcrafter's still around. Even in mono red aggro, you just have better options, so I don't think Imbued Minotaur is going to stick anywhere. The fact that it is an imbued card means I think it will see a decent amount of play as people attempt consume builds at the start of the expansion, but I think this will fall off.
Yeah, card's trash. It's a 2-star card because it definitely saw experimentation within consume, and this is one that people actually continue to try in non-consume decks for a little bit longer, but I don't think it's seen enough play in those to justify it. Specifically in that Battle Mage deck, the Prowl Smuggler was very good in. But Imbued Minotaur just didn't see consistent enough play in that. Definitely something you'll see every now and then. So worthy of a 2-star ranking, but not a staple in any deck, so we're not going to go any higher than 2.
Very heavily. Enraged Dragon Knight is very close to being a 3-star, but I will call it a 2-star. I don't think it's quite going to make it. But this definitely has a lot of potential compared to some of the other consumed cards because this is a very minor effect. This is a 4-mana 5/4 with a very minor effect, but an effect that a lot of cards generally want. The problem is I look at current aggro decks like Aggro Halalu, for example, and they don't run something like Ashlander Punisher, which I think is just a better version of this card. They don't run False Incarnate. This card's better than False Incarnate, but False Incarnate's not really a consideration anywhere. So I think there's just too much gap between an aggro deck wanting to run a 4-mana 5/4. There's not enough room there for this to fit in just because it has an effect that aggro was looking for. So I think just not quite going to be good enough. We will shout out particular mention to the Imbued Khajiit, which is Drain Synergy, 4-mana 5/4. heal for 2, deal 2 is pretty dang good. But I think just overall, it's not quite at the power level it needs to be to see consistent play.
All right, Enraged Dragon Knight is kind of on the border of a 3 and a 4-star card. This sees play in the same decks as Prowl Smuggler saw play, which is the aggressive red decks, but I think this sees play a little bit more consistently than Prowl Smuggler because it's not so tied to the ward effect. Like you'll see this a lot in Mid Archer. It's not really in any decks that I would say are easily tier 2 or anything like that, but I think it's in so many various decks and fits in so many various decks that you can make an argument that this is above 3 stars. But we will end up calling it a 3-star just because you can't really point to one specific deck where this card is amazing. It's just kind of decent in a lot of different stuff, which is, I think, what I expected going in, but I didn't expect it to quite see as much play as it does, and it doesn't see an insane amount of play or anything, but definitely if you're building a dedicated aggressive deck, this is something that usually makes it in. So pretty solid card overall. Not amazing, not spectacular, but definitely good enough to see play in anything that is kind of very, very aggressive. And there's not too many very, very aggressive decks that aren't just yellow at this point, but the ones that aren't just completely yellow, consider playing Enraged Dragon Knight. So 3-star card.
A Flame Spear Dragon is the best dragon we have in
this. That was really well
time.
timed.
Sorry, second best dragon. We'll actually get to the best dragon in just a moment. But
I think it ended up being the best dragon, actually.
It's really not doing a whole lot for me. This is 4 mana, 4/5, essentially deal 1 damage sometimes. But the 1 damage gets to be controlled by your opponent and only works if the dragon lives for a turn, which is not a given if you're playing this into Field Lane. A lot of times Field Lane is going to get you to trade up on something like a 4 or 5 because the stats aren't particularly great. Yes, you will play this in dragon decks, but dragon decks are not good. Will this make them good?
The best dragon is
not that strong. It's not going to push dragon decks. It will just be part of the dragon deck. So I don't think this is a very good card. I think the big issue here is the fact that your opponent can control it. If this was deal 1 damage at the start of your turn and you could control it, would be much different. But the idea that I think we're headed into a meta where Daggerfall Mage and Breton Conjurer will be huge parts of the meta, and this is like a positive. You would love for them to trigger your Breton Conjurer. So I think this is just, it's not enough upside to be given to a vanilla statted body to see play in anything besides dragon decks, and I don't think dragon decks will be that good.
Yeah, Flame Spear Dragon's hilarious when you're facing mid-BM. It's so unbelievably bad in that situation, and really it's just not good enough in any other situation that it's considered. Dragon's still not a thing. This expansion did not make Dragon a thing. You definitely see this card a month because it ended up being the best Dragon in the expansion. The one I thought that the one playable Dragon I thought would come out of the expansion ended up being disappointing. But yeah, this is not a particularly good card. And like I said, it didn't push dragons at all. It just exists in the dragon decks. It's just a card that exists in those, and those aren't even tier 3. Those are very bad decks. So not a good card here. This is a worthy 2-star.
It's dragon. Warhardened Sench suffers from a similar problem as
Link thought this was going to be good.
The Dragon Knight, which is that I think a 4 mana 5/4 just needs a lot to be playable right now in aggro. I think aggro around 4 mana is when they start wanting to do stuff that is immediately impacting the board. And to be fair, this can immediately impact the board when you play it on turn 4 because it will be doing the battle on turn 4. Problem with that is, what is this really battling? To get upside out of the battle, what you want to be doing is battling something and then staying alive. And the only time that's going to really do anything is on a 2-drop. And when you look at every 4-drop, if you're not trading into a 2-drop as a 4-drop, then you're not really doing anything anyway. So getting the immediate value out of it doesn't mean too much. The fact that it's only 3 health is really going to prevent it from trading into anything that costs 3 or 4 mana and sticking on the board. And in that case, it's just going to be a worse version of Lightning Bolt, which I don't think is very good. So I think this is just rough. I think doesn't do enough in either direction. I don't think for some Wax and Wane cards, you see one is good and the other is not. I think both of these are relatively poor. So I don't see this seeing a whole lot of play. I will give it a 2-star card because I think the fact that you can get to 4 mana 5/4 battle creature, that's where it changes, where you can start hitting these 3 attack creatures because there are a decent number of those. So I think some people will attempt it, but I don't think it's going to stick around.
Yeah, Warhorn Cinch sucks. 1 star. Didn't even see enough experimentation, I think, to call it a 2 star. Everybody abandoned ship on every single Wax and Wayne deck that was an Assassin or Monk or some variation of those in 3-color very quickly. And yeah, Warhorn Cinch, only person who still tries to play it is Turquoise Link, but this card is bad. 1 star.
Blast Bones is unfortunately pretty bad. It's got one of the best animations in the game, but this is comparable to a Hearthstone card called Swipe that costs 1 less and is not reliant on guards. So I just don't see a situation where this is going to be particularly good. It is just costs too much for the effect compared to something like Underworld Vigilante. This does less damage to face, but better with board control. But Underworld Vigilante was never really about board control. And the big thing with Vigilante is that sometimes it could be used in Shadow Lane to get rid of Drain creatures. That's not the case for Blast Bones. I just don't think there's enough upside here. So I think this is going to be a 1-star card. I don't think anyone is going to play this in any significant way.
Yeah, I don't think anybody played it in any significant way besides Karakhan, but I think he was just trying to prove people wrong. Really cool animation, really awesome card in general, just a cool idea, but just not powerful enough to see constructed play, so unfortunate. Something to look at after rotation for sure. I think this is... The power level in the game is so high. We'll mention this a couple of times as we go through the review. The power level in the game right now is really, really high. We have a lot of sets in the game. After they do a rotation, it'll be interesting to come back to some of these cards. Specifically, spoiler alert, every single one of the consume cards, besides the obvious overpowered ones. And this is one to definitely look at as well. When something like Vigilante rotates out, you could see aggro decks maybe start considering this, but at the moment, there's no reason to play this card.
Sense Graveprowler is a card I wish was good, but is just not. When you think about this sort of effect, you kind of jump over to Keenroll Burglar. Is this any better than a Keenroll Burglar effect? Sometimes you'll be getting more stats, sometimes you'll be getting less, but you don't have the drain. Yes, this is crazy with a Swift Strike, but this is a 6-mana 5/5 that kind of just has to sit there. When you think about the 6-mana cards in red, you're looking at stuff like Child of Hersine, which doesn't see play, and that is ridiculous. That gets to attack again without a Swift Strike. Basically, if a Child of Hersine attacks, you've won the game, and it sees no play. So you need a lot out of your 6-mana cards, and I just don't think this is quite there. I think this is a little bit better than Keenroll Burglar, but not so significantly better that it's going to see any play.
Yeah, Center at Graveprowler is another 1-star card. It is just worse than Keenroll Burglar. It sucks. I mean, the writing was kind of on the wall when this had both the Pilfer and the Consume effect. You know, you combine the badness of Pilfer with the badness of Consume. And you get Center Rot Graveprowler. It's a 1-star card.
Play. This will be the quickest one to talk about since Chernobyl, just pack filler. This isn't meant to be anything besides an arena card, so not much to talk about. This is 1-star, moving right along.
Yeah, 1-star. I don't know why we still need arena pack filler. Couldn't this have been like a 7/5? That actually would have been kind of interesting. Just power creep, Highland Lurcher. Or even like a 6... I mean, I guess it's just reverse Sench Tiger, but, I mean, come on.
Long. Pouncing Sench, I think, just has too much of a downside associated with the fact that this will occasionally be a 7/7 guard, that I don't think you can play this. On turn 7, this is a 7/7 guard, which means if you want to play this as a 7-mana 4/7 charge, you either have to save the ring charge, or you need to play this on 8, which, who cares, then it's an 8-mana 4/7 charge, and that's not particularly good. So the only good aspect of this is 7-mana 4/7 charge maybe would be good on curve, but you can't even play it on curve, so I don't think there's a lot here. I think the fact that this is good with Moongate will lead people to trying it, because 7-mana 7/7 charge is interesting to play, but I don't think this is a good card, and I think it's going to fall off.
Alright, like I said, everybody abandoned ship on every Wax and Wayne deck that wasn't Assassin, Monk, or some 3-color variations of those two. Pouncing Sench ended up being a 1-star card. Didn't even see enough play, I think, to be considered a 2-star. And yeah, as I touched on in the review, the problem, if this card legitimately is a solid card and a playable card, if on curve it was hitting the charge. But on curve, if you play this on 7 without ring, this is just a 7-mana 7/7 guard. So in the end, this is an 8-mana 4/7 guard, or a mana 4/7 plus a 1 cost card from your hand. And that's just not good enough. 7-mana 4/7 charge and guard probably would have been playable, but this one definitely got hurt by the fact that it's a Wax Wayne card. If you just removed that aspect of it, it would have been much better, unfortunately, but this ends up being a 1-star card.
All right, that was a big streak of cards that I said were bad. That was like 10 in a row. So luckily we get to talk about Mulamnir. Well, I love this is my favorite card in this set. I don't know how good
Still
it
might
is.
be my
I don't think
favorite
it's
card.
the best card in the set, but it's definitely my favorite card in the set. It's just super interesting from a perspective that you can think of a lot of different ways to combo this. On top of the fact that if you just play it, it's fine. This is probably going to be removing 2 creatures. You'd like a little bit more out of 9 mana than that, but if you're playing it in a deck that wants to use it as a combo piece to win the game, it's also not dead against aggro decks, which I think is a really big deal. Now, when you're talking about combo pieces to win the game, that's when you get to the fun stuff. That's when you get to Berserker of the Pale.
I was drinking the
giving
Kool-Aid.
this guy breakthrough allows for some pretty hefty damage from hand. You could even go as far as running Chalman Keep.
I do love this dragon. It's super fun to play.
Provide yourself a lot of targets, but you don't even really need to do that because Berserker of the Pale and Mulamnir is a 12 mana combo that kind of threatens to do something like 18 to 24 damage from hand, depending on how many creatures your opponent has.
Berserker
on
the
board.
Pale
It can do
ended
just
up being a little bit
ton
too
of
bad
damage.
to play.
So threatening lethal from that position while also not being a bad defensive card, I think makes this very, very viable. I think when you look at a lot of Rage decks that are around tier 2, the Rage Guildsworn and Rage Crusader, I think really look at this. And then the fact that that combo, the Mulamnir Berserker of the Pale combo, is 12 mana and it is only red, can be played in any single red class. It is not class restricted. Like this can only be played in Ebonheart or something like that. Like the Flesh Atromenor's Ring combo, like that was limited to purple and blue decks. This could be played in anything that has red, and I think that's a big deal. So you could kind of put this as a finisher in any proactive Rage deck, and that's really good to me. I think this is going to see a ton of play. I'm not sure if the decks it's in will end up being tier 1, which is why this is going to be rated as a 4-star. But I think this is very, very solid. And has a lot of potential home. So really excited to try this one out. It's going to be so much fun. This is my Arsenium Forge. For the second straight time, actually, my favorite card was revealed by Aquaman88. So shout out. Cheers, Aquaman. Thank you for your cards.
Big Murder Dragon. Ended up being a little bit disappointing. The combo doesn't end up being enough to carry a deck just because you have to play Berserker the Pale in your deck, and Berserker the Pale is a trash card. And I can't even make the excuse that, like, if the decks that we're in were just better. Like, in theory, this guy fits in, Rage Guildsworn. In theory, this guy fits in, Rage Crusader, Rage Dagoth, but he's just not played in them. For whatever reason, he's just not good enough. I think it's because if you're not comboing, he's just not getting enough value for 9 mana, and if you're comboing, you have to be including bad cards in your deck. So it's unfortunate. I thought it was going to be a little bit easier to get value out of this guy, and unfortunately just wasn't able to. Mulamnir is a unfortunate 2-star card, not finding a permanent home anywhere. He's still not bad to put in any control deck. Like, keep that in mind. He's not a bad card to put in a control deck. He's just very frequently not included because he's not good enough. But your deck's not going to be significantly worse if you add him. So, but yeah, he didn't end up being nearly as good as I thought he was going to be. Still super fun to play with. Still some really fun combo stuff to do, but just not good enough.
Midnight Trespasser, I think, is very, very strong. I mean, it's obvious that it's very strong. It's just a question of how good is it as a 1-drop, specifically because it is in the class with Crown Quartermaster, and I think if you run this head-to-head against Dominion Oathman, it loses out there. But there's decks that can't run Dominion Oathman that would run this alongside Crown Quartermaster. It is a 1-drop that scales, although it does not scale very well into the late game. So it's kind of interesting because it scales very, very well into the mid game. This is very good on, like, say, turn 4 when you play this with a 3-drop. That's when this becomes insane because this is just a 1-mana 3/3 in that scenario. But it's really not that bad if you play it on turn 1. I think the deal 2 damage from Dominion Oathman scales better than this. But again, I think there's enough that can't run Dominion Oathman that would if they could, that will end up running this card just based on the fact that this is a 1-mana 3/3 in the mid game. So I think this will see play in stuff like, you look at Mage, you look at potentially Battle Mage, you look at potentially Sorcerer. I think this is better than Iliac Sorcerer. So it'll be interesting to see if it sticks. It might just not stick because Crown Quartermaster is so good, but I think there's a lot of potential here, so I'm going to give this one 4 stars. I think this is going to see play in a decent number of tier 2 decks.
Basically exactly that. Ends up seeing it play in a decent number of tier 2 decks. Specifically, sees sometimes play in aggressive Battle Mage, which is, again, close to tier 2, close to tier 3. But the place it sees the most is in mid-blue decks that are not Battle Mage, basically. Battle Mage runs a higher curve than the other mid-blue decks, but stuff like Sorcerer, Assassin, and sometimes Mage run this guy because they go a little bit more aggressive, specifically Sorcerer and Assassin. Aggressive Assassins, this is a staple alongside Dominion Oathman. They run all three Crown Quartermaster, Dominion Oathman, and Midnight Trespasser, and go super fast, which is, again, that's one that's on the border of Tier 3, Tier 2. So this is in just a ton of Tier 2 decks, a ton of various Tier 3 decks. It's just kind of a staple in aggressive blue strategies. So yeah, 4-star card, very solid.
All right, Frazzled Elfique. 2 mana, 1/2, deal 1 damage, not particularly good. 2 mana, 2/3, obviously not particularly good. You need to be playing other Wax and Wane cards to make this worth anything, and even then, the value is relatively low, so just don't think you can justify playing this. I'm going to give this a 1-star. I don't think this sees play even in Wax and Wane roleplay decks, and we'll talk about those as we go on through this review.
All right, so it does see play in Wax and Wane roleplay decks. I was maybe too hard on it. Frazzled Elfique was the star of the expansion for the first couple of days, ends up being a 2-star card. Wax and Wane Assassin just got a lot of experimentation and got a lot of people excited about it, but we ended up moving on to a different Wax and Wane deck, which just didn't end up including Frazzled Elfique, which was the Monk. So basically, short answer is everything involved with Wax and Wane that isn't in the Wax and Wane Monk doesn't end up being that good. And as fun as it was to play Frazzled Elfique for the first couple of days, and it definitely was more powerful than I gave it credit for here, the Wax and Wane Assassin was something that a lot of people experimented with. It unfortunately just didn't end up making it into any sort of Tier 3 deck. Wax and Wane Assassin is still kind of just a meme. It's a really fun meme to play and a meme that can win games, but it's just not a very good deck. So as fun as this card is to play, Elfique ends up being a 2-star.
Khajiit Warhelm, or as I have termed it, the Cat Hat. I think it's actually really interesting because you're only paying 1 mana for a ping face effect, which is really good in some situations. If you want a very specific pilfer, something these would be bad cards, but bad cards that can trigger immediately potentially aren't bad cards anymore. So you look at stuff like Doggyrat Mystic, you look at stuff like Heretic Conjure.
All right, I should have stopped myself here.
Potentially have those options. And the big thing is you're really not paying that much for this effect because this is 1 mana worth of stats on a weapon.
The second I mentioned those cards, I should have docked a couple stars.
Not terrible. So you're paying 1 mana for the deal 1 damage to your opponent effect. The problem is this is kind of just tied to some bad cards, right? Because the pilfer cards aren't good. They just aren't. But this is really pushing those pilfer cards to the point where they maybe might be good. So I think you could see this as a package included with cards like Doggyrat Mystic or Heretic Conjure to potentially make some new archetypes or new versions of old archetypes. Don't know how good those will be. I would think probably not better than the standard versions, but I think they'll be good enough that you could potentially see one of them sneak into Tier 3. So we're going to call this one a 3-star card.
Nope. Khajiit Warhelm is a 1-star. Shout out to Gumchew in chat, who's the only guy who I think was really trying to make it work. And he did a solid job, but it ended up being just a worse version of Mid-Mage. Yeah, and the Cat Hat's not good. Pilfer cards are so bad. Guys, can we talk about something for a second? The Pilfer cards are so fucking bad. They're so bad. It's ridiculous. Just go to your collection, search Pilfer, and there's maybe like 2 playable cards. It's insane. And like both of them are from this expansion. And the Pilfer cards that end up being good are the ones with kind of smaller effects that you don't really care if they get the Pilfer off or not. But yeah, this ended up being just way too slow. This is a 1-star card. Again, shout out to Gumchew for making an effort, but oof. Cat Hat was a major disappointment.
Wandering Skeleton is the channel
This is the biggest
of
miss
this set,
of
and that I don't think is crazy powerful, but I think this just fits in so well to decks that I'm pretty sure are going to be good that I'm going to call this a 5-star card. I think this is actually our first 5-star card, so not really the most deserving one, because the power level's not insane. You can look at this and say, okay, it's not that crazy. It's 2 mana 2/2 that summons a 1/1. In some instances, it's like a 2 mana 3/3, but it's worse than a 2 mana 3/3 because you don't get it all at once. It kind of gets value traded by other 2/3s, which makes it way worse than a 2 mana 3/3. The big thing is this is, I think, pretty distinctly the second best 2-drop in blue. And I think there's going to be a lot of encouragement to be playing blue-heavy lists because of the release of stuff like Elfique Conjure, which promotes use of both Breton Conjure and Mighty Conjuring. So you're going to see a lot of people going for Cunning Ally percentage and a lot of people going for Doomfang Ally percentage because hitting those both
ended up
is
being
worth putting a lot of blue in your deck. I think this is pretty distinctly the second best blue drop in 2 behind Wardcrafter. Obviously, you play Harpy, but Harpy isn't particularly a 2-drop. It's just a card that happens to cost 2. I had played versions of mono blue decks before, and those ones were running stuff like Satanine Courier just as a regular 2-drop. You run Luzzer with basically no triggers for it because you need something. I think this is better than all of those, and I think stuff like Mid-BM, which is going to be a tier 1 deck in my opinion, I think potentially stuff like Mid-Range Assassin and Mid-Range Mage will be around tier 2. So I think this has just a ton of potential in every blue deck that doesn't also have purple. The purple 2-drops are obviously way better than this, but otherwise, if you're going for Cunning Ally percentage, Doomfang Ally percentage, I think this is going to be a staple because it's just kind of standard basic good. It doesn't need anything to make it better. It doesn't need any support. It's just 2 mana, 2/2, summons a 1/1. That's fine. You'll pay 2 mana for that. It's good. Blue doesn't have a lot of good 2-drops, so I really think this is going to stick.
Did not stick. I played it for a while. It's not a bad card by any means. And you can play this in Mid-BM fine, but not enough people did for me to really give it any credit for that. Weirdly enough, I was correct on Mid-BM not having any 2s. It's been that way forever, but the most popular Mid-BM builds just didn't try to answer that. They still ran no 2s. And just ran more defensive cards to get to Alfiq more consistently. For whatever reason, Mid-BM can survive without 2-drops. It can survive while missing its curve. It's just because its swing turns are so insane with Breton Conjurer, with Alfiq Conjurer, so it didn't end up needing the 2-drops. And that was basically entirely what this rating was based on, was I thought the mid-blue decks were going to need more 2-drops. They did not end up needing more 2-drops, so nobody played this one. I do think it's still pretty distinctly the second best 2-drop in blue behind Wardcrafter, but the problem is you have other colors to pair with it. Blue doesn't really need that many 2-drops. Besides Luzra, of course, Luzra is a unique legendary, so it's kind of in a different zone. But unfortunately, again, they just didn't end up using 2-drops. So this ends up being a 2-star card. I was definitely way off on this one. I thought this was going to be a mid-BM staple. It does not end up being a mid-BM staple. As you heard me describe it, I didn't think it was that powerful, but based on my rating system, if you're a staple in a tier 1 deck, you're a 5-star card. I thought this was going to be a staple in a tier 1 deck. It ends up not being so. So this is a 2-star card. Saw a little bit of experimentation in mid-BM. Saw a lot of play in when people were doing the stupid fucking Lich Quest for the Sorcerer. But yeah.
Cartel Arcanist is another example of a Wax and Wane card where there isn't really a good option. You have a 3-mana 4/3, which is not particularly good because you compare that to something like an Amber's Keeper, and it's strictly worse. Fan of Scribe, it's strictly worse. And then you think Wane, Shackle an enemy creature, and that's Dwarven Sphere. But the fact that it's a Khajiit is strictly worse because the only time Dwarven Sphere saw any play was either in Shackle roleplay decks or in Dwemer decks, like neutral decks. So I don't think either of these effects are good enough, and I don't think the versatility is actually versatility. I think with the Wax and Wane, the best ones are the ones where you don't want a specific effect most of the time, and Shackle effects are, in general, very timely. You need Shackles when you need them. You can't just wait on the Shackles. So the fact that this doesn't always Shackle is a problem, and I think there's just not enough upside here to be put in your deck. I don't think it's even going to be tried out significantly. I think this is going to be a 1-star card.
Yeah. Cartel Arcanist sucks. Both of these effects are mediocre. This was, I think, one of the first cuts from Wax and Wane roleplay decks when people were doing Assassins. Is like, even in Wax and Wane, this wasn't good enough. Like, even if you get both effects, it's an Ash Oppressor. And you need to have played another card to get both effects. You need to have played Moongate. So it's like, the upside on this card is so low.
I think Discerning Thief is a card. It's an example of something that looks a lot better than it is, specifically because I think Pilfer is a lot harder to trigger than people realize. Obviously, this is a solid effect in basically any deck if you can get the Pilfer off, but I think most of the time your 3-mana 3/4 doesn't want to be going face. If you're playing a 3-mana 3/4 stat line, you want to be using it mostly for trading, and obviously you see Grey Viper Brigand work its way into decks. I think that's a bit of an anomaly. I don't think we can expect 3-mana 3/4 plus a minor effect to end up being good. There's a lot of those in the game that don't see play. I think this will be another on that pile. This one I definitely could be wrong about, though, because this is just, a standard, only a positive effect, and we are seeing some 3-mana 3/4 see play right now, but I don't think this is enough. I think the fact that you're going to be trading a lot means that you don't really care about the Pilfer effect. You would rather this have some minor effect like Keeper of Whispers where you're immune to silence in most situations, and you aren't considering playing that card. So I think this is just going to be on the outside looking in, but definitely something I could be wrong about.
All right, Discerning Thief. So I basically reversed Wandering Skeleton and Discerning Thief in terms of my ratings. I thought Wandering Skeleton wasn't that powerful of a card, but it would be a staple in a tier 1 deck and therefore would be 5 stars. I thought this would be close, but not quite powerful enough to be a staple in the tier 1 deck. Ends up being reverse of that. Discerning Thief is a 5-star card. It's one of only 3 of them in the set. Upon re-review, you can guess one of them, and then the other one we'll get to later. But Discerning Thief ends up being a staple in a lot of different decks. Basically everything. The big miss here was 75. I was definitely not wrong in terms of blue 3-drops comparing this to Doomfang and Daggerfall and Cunning Ally, which all ended up kind of becoming a big part of the meta. But I did undersell how powerful this was because this can compete, I think, with Daggerfall Mage in terms of pushing that out of the lists. And in 75, you also have more room to put in 3-drops, so you have more room to play basically all of those. So this was something that saw play in Guildsworn, Tribunal, Mid-BM, saw scattered play across a bunch of tier 1 decks. I don't know if it was like pure staple among anything, but I would give this card a 5-star. I think it's about 4-star in terms of power level, but the decks it's in are just so good right now that you can't call this anything but a 5-star. So I was definitely off on this. I reversed Wandering Skeleton in this one in terms of power level, but definitely a learning experience. Always consider 75 card decks, the 3-color decks, when you're comparing directly in something else's color, because you can't really run Doomfang in 75. Plus, if you really wanted to, you could just run this alongside it. You need a certain amount of 3-drops in 75 anyway.
I think Black Room Neophyte is going to be in a lot of stuff, specifically Telvanni, which I believe is going to be a tier 1 deck, and I think this also may push a tier 2 deck. We'll talk about this with a package of a couple of cards, but I think this is very strong in Dagoth. This card is tied to, I think, the lethal keyword. If this is getting the lethal keyword, this is very, very good. 4 mana, 4/3, summon a 1/1 lethal, I think is a ridiculous card. You have a Territorial Viper, obviously, so if this is ever hitting Viper, this is insane, but it doesn't have to be. It can be hitting Alt Velothi Assassin, or Fighter's Guild Recruit, or Sanctuary Pet. Anything that has lethal, I think, is tied to this card. So I think you look at Control Dagoth and potentially Control Telvanni as homes for this card. So I look forward to giving those a try. I think, again, I very much think this is tied to the lethal keyword. So if those kind of control styles don't end up working, you won't see this card, but I really do think this is going to be an inclusion in the tier 1 deck, which is Telvanni, and potentially push some of the other tier 3 decks into tier 2 as far as control goes, because this is a ridiculously powerful control tool in the early game for a lot of these decks that just don't have it.
So most of this I'm trying to do to be outside of my personal bias. There's this card and one other card that I will let my personal bias shine through. By play rate, this should be a 3-star card. I'm going to call it a 4-star on review because I think 100% this should be staple in every single Telvanni deck. I think this is absolutely fantastic in Telvanni, and I can't imagine running any Control Telvanni deck without it. And I think Control Telvanni is hovering around tier 2 at the moment, so it makes it, by those rules, I think it would be a 4-star. A lot of people aren't playing it in Control Telvanni. I think that's incorrect. I think this is just insane in Control Telvanni. I think this is one of the top 5 cards in Control Telvanni in the deck overall, which is a tier 2 deck. So we're going to let the personal bias shine through. By how much I've seen it, it would be a 3-star, but I'm going to call it a 4-star on review. I think this is absolutely fantastic.
Goutfang Adept is another one that doesn't really have a good version. 4 mana 2/4 draw card is pretty well below the power curve, and 4 mana 3/5 card is obviously below the power curve. So I just don't think there's a good option for this. You might want to give all of these an extra look that have draw card written, because those are kind of the best options for the Moongate. Is if you're worried about value out of the Moongate, you run a lot of the draw cards, and you hope you get some of that back. But I think there's more upside in a card like Hatchery Meddler, which is a 4 mana 3/5 that could change to be a 5/3 or could swap somebody else's stats. I think there's much higher upside than just having guard versus this card. So I think that card wasn't even remotely close to playable. So this is going to be on the outside looking in. I don't even think it's going to be attempted. This is going to be a 1-star card.
This one's a 2-star card. Courtesy of Waxwayne Assassin, people are definitely trying this for a while. People actually tried this a little bit in various other control decks as well. It just doesn't end up being good enough. Its average value is okay, right? Like, this is not necessarily a bad card. If you put a card in your deck that was straight up, it was like 4 mana 3/5 against aggro, 4 mana 2/4 draw against control, that would seem fine. And that's close to what this is, because unlike the Pouncing Cinch, it actually ends up being ends up working out exactly how you want it to work out, which is to say, on turn 4, if you want to play this defensively, it's got the stats. Versus Pouncing Cinch, where if you wanted to play that on curve, it would be the worst version. This ends up being a little bit better, maybe higher than 2 stars, you could argue, but I think I'm going to put it in 2-star because despite the fact that people have tried it a little bit, I don't think it ended up making it consistently into any deck besides the Waxwing Assassin, which again I don't think made it to tier 3. That is a tier, below tier 3, however tiers you want to do below 3. That ended up being kind of a fun deck, but not a good deck, and that was the best place for Goutfang. So I think 2-star card for Goutfang Adept.
I think this would, even on a full lane, this is not
sucks so
particularly strong. Imperial Reinforcements is not that good. So if this is hitting anything less than 4, it's absolutely terrible. If it's hitting 4, it's still not that good. So I just don't think this is going to see play anywhere. This is a 1-star card.
Yeah, card sucks. I had to get it on the screen to say that it sucks, so you guys would know which card I was talking about. I mean, the next card sucks too, but this card in particular sucks.
Not particular. Imbued Breton was kind of the one hope for Consume, I think, as a mechanic. I think this ward needed to be lower down the curve for all of the Consume cards to be playable. But the fact that this is a 5-mana 4/4, I think potentially just kills Consume. This is just too expensive and not good enough on its own. 5-mana cards have just so much competition right now that I don't think you can justify playing a 5-mana 4/4 ward, especially not just for Consume cards that are lower on the curve than this. Will have to be played after this, but are lower on the curve than this. It's just, I don't see it being any good. I think the fact that it's a 5-mana 4/4 ward will push it to see a little bit more play than it probably deserves to, but I think this will fall off relatively quickly. I don't see Imbued Breton making a mark on the meta just because this is too late on the curve. It really needed to be like a 3 or 4.
Yeah, so for background, when all the Imbued cards were revealed, I believe this was the last Imbued card that got revealed. I think it might have come out at the same time as Minotaur, but we had all kind of assumed after the first couple that, okay, the Imbued card for blue is going to have Ward. And at that point, because we had seen a lot of the Consume synergy cards, it was that like, okay, this card needs to be good for Consume to be good, because Ward is obviously a better keyword than anything, like Breakthrough or Lethal or that kind of stuff. Lethal is situationally better, but Ward, in terms of aggressive strategies, Ward is just so valuable. So this needed to be lower on the curve for Consume to be viable, and it just wasn't. 5 mana, just too late for this to come down. There's ways to get it out of your hand, obviously, but it doesn't, it's not as good as playing it and then getting value out of the graveyard. That's what Consume needed to be viable, and it didn't end up getting it because this card just cost too much. So this is a 2-star card. Saw experimentation with a lot of Consume, but Consume didn't end up making a mark in the meta.
In theory, this is 5 mana 7/7 worth of stats on an empty lane, but it is worse than 7/7 because it's divided in a disadvantageous way. Also, you're usually going to be playing this to contest something, which means you probably already have a creature on the board, which means it's probably only going to end up being like a 5 mana 5/6 that's distributed in a bad way. So I don't think Vastery is particularly strong. I think, but maybe if we see Token Mage become part of the meta, it might play this, but I think there's still even better options for Token Mage, even if you're a Fervor deck. I just don't see this being particularly strong, especially because Fervor has to come down before this to be effective, so it's really not coming down on turn 5, it's coming down more on like turn 6 or 7, and in that situation, it's just not that strong. Bone Colossus doesn't really see any play right now, which obviously is scaled upwards, but I think is just a much better card than this. So I think it will see some experimentation because it will be tempting for people who are running the token decks, but I don't think it's going to be that strong.
It wasn't that strong. Didn't even make it into token decks. Token Mage actually ended up being okay, like variations. I mean, it wasn't really Token Mage, it was just mid-mage that ran Resolute Ally, but it ended up being an okay deck. Didn't run Vastery. Vastery sucks. Like I said, like the problem is, in theory, it's a 5 mana 7/7. In reality, it's not really a 5 mana 7/7. It's usually a 5 mana 5/6, and all the 1/1s get traded away super easily. So yeah, 1-star card. Oh, do I even need to talk about this? I mean, we all knew Alfeek was going to be insane. Do we even have to watch? You're going to listen to me tell you that Alfeek was good.
And a 6 mana 8/7 worth of stats that has partial guard, and the guard is really what makes this because it lets you develop it onto a threatening board but still be defending yourself in some way. But most importantly, It rewards you for playing Breton Conjure, which if you're a mid BM, you're already playing. It also rewards you for playing and
we don't even have to go about this. Alfie Conjure was obviously insane. The second it got revealed, everybody knew it was overpowered. It got nerfed in the first patch. After it got released, it's still probably too powerful. I don't know why the fuck this thing has guard. Like, seriously, why does this have guard? Doesn't even make sense, like, thematically, for it to have guard. Why does this card have guard? It would be so much better if it just didn't have guard. I mean, not it would be a worse card, but it would be so much better for the game if it just didn't have guard. But yeah, Alvik's easy 5-star. If you could go higher than 5 stars on this rating system, we'd go higher than 5 stars. Card was instantly broken, and everybody knew it. We don't have to spend more time on it.
I think Glacial Dragon is probably the most overrated card in the set. I think a lot of people like this because they like dragons, but when you stop and think of it, this is just a strictly worse version of Doomcrag Vampire.
Yep.
While it does immediately shackle, Doomcrag Vampire is not limited to only dragons for the effect, and rather than shackling, it kills. Doomcrag Vampire is also a card that is falling out of the meta right now and is not particularly strong, so I think this is a significantly worse version of that encourages you to play bad cards, and I just don't see it. I don't see why you would want to do that over doing Doomcrag, and I don't see why you would want to do Doomcrag right now. So I don't think this pushes dragon decks. I think this is worse than most of the regular dragons that are already in the game. I think this is probably worse than Icewing Dragon, and I just don't think this is what non-uniques needed to kind of get pushed a little bit. So I think this is definitely not gonna push dragons in any sort of way, and unfortunately I think that's true of basically all of the dragons that got released. So it's a bit unfortunate that we did have a good number of dragons in this expansion, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of movement based on those dragons.
Yeah, we'll talk about all that when we get to Calgranti. Glacial Dragon's not that good. It's a 2-star card, so it sees plenty of experimentation, and it's a fun little tribal card. Like, you can do some cool stuff with Frostscale Dragon and Tiny Dragon, but the decks it's in are just bad. Dragon decks are just not good enough. Certainly fun to play. You can make a Dragon Guildsworn that can win games, but it just ends up being a worse version of mid-range Guildsworn, so yeah. Glacial Dragon, 2-star card, not particularly good.
Skeletal Mage is a really interesting one because I only see one home.
This one is so disappointing.
I see 2 homes, but I think it doesn't make the cut in one. I think it will make the cut in the other, and I think that will end up being a tier 3 deck. So I'm going to give this 3 stars. I think this is going to be good in exactly Control Dagoth. This card combined with Imbued Altmer, or soon to become Imbued Bosmer, because they're changing it from a high elf to a wood elf, is absolutely fantastic. If you're able to hit the lethal consume, this is a 7 mana 4/6 that still has lethal and has already killed the creature, because whatever it deals damage to will take the lethal damage and obviously die. So I think that's insane. And I think you can play Control Dagoth enough that this is having good targets like Tel'Vos Magister, like a Hand of Dagoth. So this is consistently dealing 5, even if it's not hitting the Imbued Altmer. So I think this is going to end up being a strong card in that. It's just a matter of how good that deck is going to end up being. I think it'll hover around somewhere around tier 3. So I think Skeletal Mage will be a pretty solid card. I really like this card as a rule. I think this is just some of the synergy this has can be used in really interesting ways. And I think that even though it's bad on the surface, you might find some potential here if you pair it with the right cards.
It worked. Control Dagoth just remains so disappointing. Control Dagoth does not have a consistent win condition. You can play this in Control Dagoth and it's fine. Control Dagoth is just so trash compared to mid-range styles of Dagoth that there's no reason to do it. Or compared to, like, you share 2 of the colors with Telvanni, and Hand of Dagoth is good, but it's not worth giving up everything that purple provides. And, like, Sun and Shadow is almost as good as Hand of Dagoth, so yeah, it doesn't end up being good enough. I wanted it to be good so bad. It and Imbued Bosmer, I really thought were going to make Control Dagoth a thing, but in the end, Control Dagoth's problem is still just it can't finish the game off. I think I was the only person who really gave this card any credit. 1 star. Doesn't see play anywhere.
So we're in the awkward position of we have such a high power level in this game right now that I have to talk about whether I think a 1-mana 1/5 is good. And unfortunately, I don't think it's good. I think this isn't good enough, even though you're playing this on 1 mana for the wax effect. You can play this on turn 1 and just get a 1-mana 1/5. I don't think that's particularly strong. I think in the past we've seen a lot of these cards potentially printed as aggro cards that have, high health, low attack. When they're this low and you're forced to buff them, they really lose a lot of value because you're kind of forced to have other buff cards to really make them do anything. There's also the aspect of Fighters Guild Recruit, which is always going to be a part of the meta, at least until it gets nerfed. This is Lethals, Eat This for Breakfast, Sanctuary Pet, Fighters Guild Recruit, Astrid, all of them just gobble this card up. They don't care. They're going to trade 2 for 1 on it, and then you're going to move on with 1 less card in your hand. So I think there's just too much downside associated with playing a 1-mana card that even though this has 6 stats, the fact that you need to buff it and this is still a 1-mana card that really doesn't scale that well into the late game unless you need healing, that I just don't think it's going to make it. I think it's going to be tried out a lot, in specifically in Crusader. But I think like when you think, I wouldn't play this in Halalu, maybe Crusader though. Crusader isn't that much worse than Halalu. Crusader is in a situation where you have to play bad cards in the deck just because you don't have access to green. You can play some good ass cards in Crusader. So I just don't see any situation where this cracks the list. I think there's too much downside associated with it.
All right, welcome to the most complicated rating of the set. So I rated Moon Bishop a 2-star. Keep in mind, one thing that is key to remember is this review was done before we knew the monthly. So this is probably the card that got most affected by the monthly, or one of the cards that got most affected by the monthly, which was Apprentice Necromancer, which made this a legitimate option in conscription decks. Over something like Guildsworn Revitalizer, just giving some chip heal. Outside of that, it really only saw play in the Waxwayne Monk, and that was a tier 3 deck, and it wasn't consistently in that deck. So outside of that, I think the 2-star rating is correct. But because, and this is the second one I will talk about, this in Black Worm Neophyte, I will talk with personal bias. I think this plus Apprentice Necromancer, now that card has been released, is absolutely insane in conscription decks. And I think Apprentice Necromancer has a lot of control applications that people aren't using yet, but I think are very, very powerful. So I would call this a 4-star after the release of Apprentice Necromancer. Before it, I would call it a 2. This is it's tough to rate it because this is one that really changed after it got released. And we only had a couple of days before Apprentice Necromancer kind of came out after Moons of Elsweyr. So it's really tough to figure out exactly how good this would have been without Apprentice Necromancer. So you could call this a 2-star because Necromancer ended up making it a little bit better. You could call it a 4-star because I think it's very, very strong now. Or you could call it a question mark because we just didn't get enough time to figure out how good it was. But yeah, this is probably the most complicated card in this set.
I think Rebel Warden is a worse version of Descendant of Valkosh, as well as a worse version of Scouting Patrol. So I don't think there's much to say on it. Don't think it's going to see any play. This is a 1-star card. Should have given it a little bit more credit than that. It's a 2-star card. Sees scattered play in various decks. Various Spellsword decks play it. Again, this is another one that really got buffed with the addition of Apprentice Necromancer. So it's tough to figure out exactly how good this would have been. When I judge these cards, I judge them based on the card pool they're entering. I can't predict the future. I can't predict like Apprentice Necromancer. If there was a really bad Mud Crab in this set, it's tough to predict. Hey, Old Salty's Assault's going to be a thing. And figure out that, okay, every single Mud Crab is going to instantly jump up. And that's sort of the same thing for this on a smaller scale, because Apprentice Necromancer definitely helped this card a lot. And it's tough to figure out exactly where it would have been without Apprentice Necromancer. I think it would have been a 2-star without Apprentice Necromancer, because I think it still would have been a 2-star rather without Apprentice Necromancer, because I think you saw some people try this in Crusader. Specifically, like any deck that's running Fervor can make use of this. It's not a particularly strong card. I still don't think it's a particularly strong card, but the place you see it the most is that Token Spellsword with Apprentice Necromancer. Apprentice Necromancer, outside of Alfie Conjurer, would have been more powerful than any of the cards in this set, which is crazy. That the second most powerful card, basically in the Moons of Elsweyr set, wasn't released in Moons of Elsweyr. It was released like 5 days after Moons of Elsweyr. So it's really awkward. But yeah, it's definitely not a 1-star. Sees more play than that now. I think even without Apprentice Necromancer, this wouldn't have been a 1-star. I think you would have seen like just enough of this in like other styles. But yeah, this is mostly in Spellsword now. It's tough to rate these. Both this and Moon Bishop definitely got pushed a lot by the release of a card that we just didn't know about at the time of the review. So I am in the awkward position that I think this is the most powerful card in the set from a raw power level standpoint. I
still think
this
that's
is the
probably
strongest card in
true.
the set, but I'm going to be rating it as a 2-star because I don't think the deck is going to work. I think the big problem with this card is because pilfer cards in this game are so unbelievably bad. This is tied to Thieves' Den. You have to be able to run Thieves' Den in your deck for this to be worth it. And in that case, the fact that it's a lower cost doesn't really matter because you're going to have to eat 4 mana at some point in the game to play a low impact card. Now, there's payoffs for Thieves' Den. there's 3 payoffs specifically. There's this card, Smash and Grab. There's Master of Thieves, and there's another Pilfer card we're going to be seeing coming up. There are payoffs for Thieves' Den. Thieves' Den might become good enough to be played in this meta. Legitimately, because the payoffs for it can be so strong, Thieves' Den might be good. I'm going to lean towards no. I don't think Thieves' Den is going to make it, which means I don't think this card is going to make it. Despite being as powerful as it is, the Pilfer cards are so bad, you have to be playing something that gives global Pilfer like Bandit Ringleader or Thieves' Den for this to be worth it. I don't think you're going to be doing that. I don't think those decks are going to be good enough to crack tier 3, so I think this card's going to be a 2-star card as people try it out and eventually move away from those builds.
Oh, Smash and Grab. It's crazy powerful, guys. It's crazy powerful. This is probably the best example of how bad Pilfer is. Because this is a fucking 2-mana Savage Roar. Savage, like Hearthstone at its highest power level, people still played Savage Roar. And this is a discount on Savage Roar that can hit more creatures because Tesla has higher board space, plus it has Shadowlane, so it's easier to hide small creatures and get them to attack. But it doesn't matter because Pilfer is so fucking bad. It's so bad, guys. It's so bad. But yeah, as you can see, I rated it a 2-star. I thought people would experiment it with a little bit more. Like I said, there's not really that much difference between a 1 and a 2-star card. It's just play rate. 1 and 2-star cards are close in power level. This ends up being a 1-star. Didn't even see enough experimentation. People figured out pretty damn quickly that Pilfer fucking sucks. Pilfer's really bad. But yeah, really powerful card. If they ever print reliable good Pilfer effects, Smash and Grab is going to be insane. The raw power level on this card is so high, but the Pilfer cards are so bad. Also might be the best card in the set. This is up there. This is top 5 for sure. I think this is absolutely fantastic. Anybody who's played Rift Thane knows how much better guard mode Rift Thane is than attack mode Rift Thane. 2 mana 2/4 is just a very good stat line, and unlike the 1 mana 1/5 we just talked about, this doesn't really need any help. It loves buffs. It loves Scimitar. It loves Orc Clan Captain. But it still trades into 2 mana 3/2s without any of that. It still trades evenly with most 2-drops for without any buffs. It still trades 2 for 1 with a lot of 2-drops without any buffs, and I think that's a really big deal. So just getting early board advantage on something that likes buffs but doesn't need it is such a big deal that this stat line is really, really good, and this will see play. I think this is going to become a staple in both Halalu and Crusader, and yeah, I think this is just a very strong card, even though it's just vanilla. It's just so much better than the other options that Yellow has right now, like Broomer Profiteer and like Cleric of Kine. I would much rather play this card over them. So I think we're going to see a ton of this. I think this is very good. Just kind of a new baseline power level for 2-drops. Yeah, this one's 5 stars. This is the third 5-star in the set. Spoiler alert, none of the other ones are 5-star. If Apprentice Necromancer was in this set and not a monthly that came out a couple after, that would also be 5 stars. But this one's insane. This is... don't have to talk about this one that much. Basically every aggro yellow deck plays it in aggro yellow. This actually pushed aggro yellow a little bit. It's debatable how much it actually pushed it, because aggro yellow is already pretty good, and it didn't really change the tiers, but I think significantly when you play aggro yellow you can feel that this is so much better in terms of just kind of getting value out of your 2-drops. I mean, it's just value trades other 2-drops so easily. Pretty much every 3/2 in the game, and 3/2s do see play, even if it's not as many 3/2s as 2/3s. Still sees play. This not value trades, but this trades 1 for 1 with most 3-drops. This trades 1 for 1 with a Discerning Thief, which is one of the best 3-drops in the game. Yeah, this card's good. It's really good. It sees play in basically every aggro yellow deck, and there's a lot of good aggro yellow decks. Crusader and Spellsword right now are both pretty fantastic. Mage is very good. I think a little bit underplayed. Yeah, this card's very, very good. I think we generally all kind of knew that. 2 mana 2/4 is just a good stat line. Nothing else really matters. It's a good stat line, and it triggers Resolute Ally. So I've gone back and forth with this card on whether I think I almost nailed it. Almost.
Listen, Moongate deck will end up being something around tier 4 or tier 3. I don't think it's going to be any higher than that. And I think I ended up on thinking it wasn't going to break into tier 3. So this card, I think, is one of the reasons to run Moongate versus Waxes and Wanes. Now, this is one of the one of the lesser cards for Wax and Wane. But this is also one of the cards where with Wax and Wane, if you're getting both effects, you get more out of it because the effects complement each other. With the other ones, it's not really that case. You just kind of play one good card, right? You play a 3-mana 2/2 silent or 3-mana 4/4 silence. Like that's what you get. So you get essentially a 2/2 buff. This is much different in that it summons the entire other copy and buffs it. So this is kind of a big deal, especially with the one curving into the 4-mana guy who triggers both Waxes and Wanes. So if you manage to go Moongate into this, into him, becomes absolutely insane. And you're just filling up the board with 3/3s and a couple of 4/5s as well, and actually 5/5 from the 4-mana guy. And that's really strong. But the question is, how good is that deck going to be around it? Is that a small enough core that you can include just those cards and be happy with it? The answer is probably not. You're probably going to have to build your deck more around it, and I think that's going to bring the deck down because the quality of the cards just isn't that high. So All Fake Illusionist, I think, is going to end up being a 2-star card. It is on the border of being a 3 because I think there's a chance that Monk, Empire, something using yellow and green with Wax and Wane cracks it into 2 or 3, but I would lean towards that not happening at the moment.
You could tell you could tell I saw the potential in this because I think the aspect of general value, which was what a lot of people thought Moongate was going to be, was not the right way to go about it. I saw a ton of potential here with because this is something that really, really becomes significantly more powerful when utilized with Moongate. It's not just slightly better; it's significantly better. It's basically doubling the value. In a lot of cases, that's not true because the fact that this says copy means you're basically doubling all of the stat line. If you're doubling like the 3-mana 2/2 guy, it's like, okay, you're getting an extra +2/+2. In this case, you're getting an extra 4/5 guard. Yeah, my frames are going. But yeah, I think this ends up being the reason to run Moongate. This ends up being the reason to run Wax and Wane. And I was close to figuring that out, but I didn't think the deck was quite going to make it. And for a bit, I was correct. This is almost reverse Transitus Shrine, where when Transitus Shrine came out, I was convinced that it was broken, and I tried to make the deck to prove myself right. With this, I was convinced that Wax and Wane wouldn't be good enough, and I kind of tried to focus on proving myself wrong. I played a ton of Wax and Wane Monk, and I thought it was powerful enough to be a tier 3 deck. But it didn't catch on until recently because Iane made a deck, and everybody respects Iane more than me, as they should, because he's a better player. But we saw a lot more people try to pick this up after Iane started playing Wax and Wane Monk, and there's a lot of power level there. There really is. This is a very, very strong card. The deck, I don't think, is anything higher than tier 3, but tier 3 is still something, and this is definitely the reason it's tier 3. This and 2 other cards push this into tier 3. Without it, it wouldn't even be close to existing. So this is a 4-star card based on my rating system. I do think Wax Wane Monk is a tier 3 deck, and this pushes it. So yeah, this was... I thought if any Wax Wane deck was going to form, it was going to be something revolving around this, and it ends up being so. I just didn't really have the guts to call it.
Be at Peace is really bad.
Why I was slightly off center.
This is a 1-mana tax on Trespasser's Bane, which was already a card that saw no play. For the addition of Prophecy, not paying that price. Wasn't paying the price for 2. I'm not going to pay it at 3, so Be at Peace, 1-star card.
Sucks. 1 star.
Imbued Khajiit has a lot of potential because giving Drain is potentially more valuable than giving any of the other keywords provided by the imbued creatures, but I don't think it is good enough. I think 3-mana 2/4 Drain is just not a very good stat line. I think 3 mana is just, you can do better than that. And I think there's not enough creatures that want to use the Consume that this is going to end up making the list. I think this is just not good enough to justify running bad cards. This has potential, obviously, because giving Drain is so powerful, but you really have to pay a tax on that. You have to pay almost a 1-mana tax on how your creature is. You have a 2-mana 2/4 in yellow that's just vanilla that you pay 2 mana for. So this is an extra mana for the tax on maybe getting Drain on a creature later in the game, and I just think that's not there. I think that's not good enough, and Imbued Khajiit will see some testing as people try out Consume, but they will move on to more refined decks.
All right, let's get back to the review. Imbued Khajiit is not very good because people went off of yellow Consume pretty quickly. Consume overall, people kind of got up quickly, but this didn't even see enough experimentation to get to 2-star. It's just not a very high power level card. Consuming to give Drain is nice, but it's such a bad card to have to play. 3-mana 2/4 Drain is just not very good. It's a 1-star, no experimentation, no home for it. Not good.
Cygnus Standard Bearer is pretty clearly supposed to be in something like the forward camp deck, but the fact that you need
So fun.
2 supports to trigger this card kind of breaks it, because then stats matter more on curve than at any other time in the game. So if you're not getting this on curve with 2 supports, it's bad. It's worse than Imperial Reinforcements if you're playing this on even with a Fervor up, this is worse than Imperial Reinforcements unless it has 2 supports. And obviously Fervor is kind of tied to this card. So I think this is trying to push the forward camp deck, but it's not quite there. Not going to see enough play even justify being a 2-star. I think this is a 1-star card.
Cygnus Standard Bearer is a 2-star card. The support decks end up making it close. I don't think any of them are really a part of the meta right now. But forward camp Cygnus Standard Bearer is on the border. There's definitely potential in the future for this to become a thing. The closest deck right now uses Moongate. It is the Wax and Wayne monk that uses forward camp and Moongate, because Moongate's a low cost of support. I think in general that's just worse than the regular versions of Waxway Monk, but the deck is close. Even if I don't think one of the support decks with forward camp has pushed into the meta quite yet, I think in the future this is something to look out for. So I definitely underrated the power level of this card, but has not seen quite enough play to make it into the 3-star category. I'm going to call this a 2-star.
I think Mercenary Captain is a way for decks that don't have Resolute Ally or can't pull off mono yellow to kind of push that same sort of style where they have redundancy on the effect, specifically in 75 cards. I think they will be worse than the Resolute Ally versions of those decks, because Resolute Ally is just a much stronger card than this, because this is a 4-mana 2/2, kind of needs 2 creatures on the board at least, maybe needs 3 creatures on the board to be kind of okay. But I think there's a lot of synergy, and enough synergy that a deck involving this will hit tier 3. Something like a 3-color token deck, like a Dominion, I think aggro may play this, like a Guildsworn aggro may play this. But I just think it'll be pretty distinctly worse than the cards that the decks that can afford to run something better. Decks like Halali wouldn't consider this card just because they have better options. Decks like Crusader have Resolute Ally, and I don't think you're going to see any of those decks include this card over any of the other options, and they don't need as much redundancy on the effect, or that much redundancy on the effect that they're going to play 4-mana 2/2. So definitely going to see play in some places, but I don't think it's going to be particularly strong. I think this is going to be phased out of most builds, but could potentially find a sticking point. So we're going to call it 3 stars.
All right, so this was seen sometimes in a decent amount of aggro decks that weren't spell sorted. This is another one. We're talking about it again. Apprentice Necromancer got released after Moons of Elsweyr got released. But at the time of doing this review, we did not know Apprentice Necromancer existed, and the sticking place for this card ended up being Spell Sword, because Apprentice Necromancer really let you make use of a lot of 1-drops, and this has just good synergy with it. In that, it's a 4-star card. I think without it, it's somewhere between 3 and 4, because I think this is still an option in Crusader. I don't think this is a staple in Crusader, so it would be somewhere around a 3 or a 4. But I think we can pretty safely, after the release of Apprentice Necromancer, call this a 4-star card, because it has really good synergy with that kind of deck.
Shrewd Strategist is a 4-mana yellow card, which means it's already got a lot of tough competition. I think this is tied to the effect of Nord Firebrand. This with Nord Firebrand is actually very solid, but that's a Math Crusader sort of deck. Can you afford to play this in just an aggro Crusader? Probably not. You're probably not cycling enough to get enough Firebrands for that to be good. So I think probably not going to end up making the cut anywhere. I think people will try it, though. This is going to encourage people to try out some Math Satyr decks, so we'll call this a 2-star card, but I think it'll end up not making the cut.
Shrewd Strategist is close. It's between a 2 and a 3-star card. I think it sees enough random little experimentation in Tier 1 aggro Crusader that I'm willing to call it a 3. I think it's slightly better than some of the stuff we've called 2-star cards. So yeah, I think I'm willing to call this one a 3. This one's tough because not a lot of people have come around to it, but there are a lot of people who include this as a 1 of in their deck and have found a lot of use for it, specifically in basically every form of aggro Crusader. So yeah, I think this is a 3-star upon review. It's very close between a 2 and a 3, but I'm willing to call it a 3.
But I think it'll end up not making
all the
cut.
consume cards, which people
Monastic
play.
Champion, I'm going to call a 3-star card. This was on the border of being a 2, but I'll just go ahead and say I think potentially mid-mage or mid-dominion could end up being a tier 3 deck that uses this. The big problem is you compare this to Phalanx Exemplar. I think it's the clearest comparison. Phalanx Exemplar is better in any situation where you want to be defensive, so this only really gets consideration when you have a very strong defensive early game, and that's why we're talking Mage, Monk, Dominion. I think those are the classes which, with a strong enough defensive early game, that you can afford to play a more offensive 5-drop. But I think in most cases, people are going to trend towards Phalanx Exemplar because Exemplar is just much better when you're behind on board. This is obviously better for your head, but Exemplar is just more consistent than this card, even if it has a lower ceiling. So I think this will be a 3-star card. I think it will make some lists in mid-dominion and mid-mage, but I think the better decks will end up trending towards Phalanx Exemplar.
I think it's rare that I hit a nail on the head as much as this. Like, I was really between calling this a 2 and a 3-star because I thought people would mostly play Phalanx Exemplar over it, but maybe some people would choose to play it. It ends up being exactly a 3-star because some people are choosing to play it over Phalanx Exemplar, but still Phalanx Exemplar is seen more frequently. So yeah, some of the chonk decks, as I will call them, the kind of halfway between control and mid-range, most frequently played in Guildsworn, but also played in Tribunal and Mage. Some of those decks are including Monastic Champion. Not enough. Those are tier 2 decks. It's not. They're not. This card's not in there enough for me to call it a 4-star. But because it does see some scattered play in a tier 2 deck, this is very much a 3-star card. But it's very close to not being that because it does not see a ton of play. But yeah, I think this is a 3-star card.
Tenmar Zalvit Lurker is understated for the sake of heal. I think we have a lot of cases where the understatting is a lot less vast than this, where you see something like Rift and Lawkeeper is only missing 1 stat, Golden Initiate is only missing 1 stat. Tenor Zalvit Lurker is missing at least 3 stats on being playable for a 6-drop.
Rift and Lawkeeper is actually
for the sake of heal, so I think you would just trend towards Rift and Lawkeeper if you wanted this effect, and this effect isn't important enough that people are running Rift and Lawkeeper, so I don't think they're going to run this.
Yeah, Tenor Zalvit Lurker sucks. No reason to run it. There's just better heal cards.
Queen's Captain is one of the cards that potentially pushes the Moongate deck, which again I think will probably end up being somewhere around tier 4.
Yeah, I don't play Arena, so I can't.
But
I can't.
This also has potential to see occasional play in something like a Tribunal, something like an Empire, as a late game option that is potentially more consistent than Moose, depending on how the meta goes. So I think this is going to end up being a 3-star card as something that is used mostly for the draw aspect, even though the draw aspect is the weaker aspect of the card. Because it is the one which you don't care about timing. Destroy a creature is more timing based. Draw is one where you don't really care when it happens as long as it happens. So I do think you will see this card. I think you will see it experimented with a ton. I think it's not going to stick, but I think you'll see it experimented enough in tier 1 and tier 2 decks and see it stick late enough into the meta that I'll call it a 3-star card over a 2-star card.
Right for the wrong reasons. I called this a 3-star card because I thought it was going to be in stuff like Tribunal or Empire. That is not why. It is a 3-star card, but it is in the Waxwayne Monk. I'm not willing to see that is a tier 3 deck. I've called, or I refer to it as a tier 3 deck. In this rating system, I would say the cards that push that deck would be called 4. The cards that are just staple in that deck would be 3. I don't think this is on the same level as Moongate Rebellion General and Alphaic Illusionist in that deck. I think this is, if you remove any of those cards, the deck falls apart. If you remove Queen's Captain, the deck definitely gets worse, but it does not fall apart. So I think this is a 3-star card, basically just for the Waxwing. You haven't really seen it stick anywhere else. Sometimes people will play it in control lists, but not frequently enough, I think, to be used. But this one got pushed by the fact that Alphaic Illusionist was able to carry an entire deck archetype.
So I talked about this a lot on stream.
Ooh.
Going into this expansion, there were only 3 non-unique dragons that I considered to be good or above average even cards. Those being Shearpoint Dragon, Tiny Dragon, and Blood Dragon, none of which are very good pulls off Calgronteed. So you were kind of watching, what do you get as far as non-unique dragons in the set? We've only got 3. And in my opinion, none of them are very strong, the strongest being a 4-mana 4/5 that deals 1 damage. So that's not being particularly the best pull off Calgronteed.
This is a sad dragon.
So I don't think Calgronteed's going to make
expansion.
it. I think the fact that you have to run non-unique dragons, and these non-unique dragons just in general are so bad that I think it's going to drag this card down. You look at the best cards to hit off this, you're looking at stuff like Skyboard Dragon, Skeletal Dragon, Frostscale Dragon, which are good cards, but they're not cards you're playing right now. I don't think it's worth it to put bad cards in your deck to make this good, unless it is a very...
When I say good, by the way, I left out a couple words there. They're good cards to pull off Galgronteed, but they're bad cards.
very small amount. So if this ends up seeing play, I think that's where it's going to end up being, is you do something like 2 Skeletal Dragons, and you just never get pulls off Halls of the Colossus. You don't care about Halls of the Colossus pulling more than 1. You just use it for 12 mana, 8/9 summon a Skeletal Dragon, and maybe that gets you there. But I think for the most part, this being tied to the power level of non-unique dragons is just gonna make it too weak. Potentially something to watch as they add more non-unique dragons, but again, only 3 in the set, and none of them are very good. So, and Calgrunteed's still just kind of wanting.
Yeah, Calgrunteed, not particularly good. Definitely saw plenty of experimentation. I personally experimented the crap out of this card, doing exactly what I said there, which was just running basically minimum number of dragons. I was only running Skeletals and Undyings. Those are the only pulls. And it was effective, but it was just worse than other options. It ended up being significantly worse than just running Flesh Atronach as a finisher, because unless you're running blue, you can't reliably bring this out. And the fact that you're limited basically to blue tricolor decks, you're limited to like Guildsworn, Dominion, and what's the other one? I should know the other one. Tribunal. You're limited basically to those. Because you need Lonith for consistency. You really need Lonith for the consistency on this. Otherwise, you just end up drawing all of the bad dragons before you draw Calgrunteed, and it's like, why the fuck am I even playing Calgrunteed? I have to play all of these bad cards ahead of him. It just ends up not being good enough. The non-unique dragons, again, are pretty dang bad. Undying and Skeletal are probably the best pulls off of it, but those are not cards that anybody's playing your deck. Yeah, this card was the start of my Veteran Control deck, and it just ended up getting better when we swapped it out for Reanimate, and then getting even better when we swapped it out for Flesh Atronach. So it's just, as an end game tool, it's just not good enough right now. Definitely something to watch in the future if they release like just a really good non-unique dragon that everybody's playing anyway. Then Calgrunteed becomes a consideration, but as of right now, this is just a 2-star card. People definitely tried it out, but it was not good enough to carry a deck.
Altmer / Imbued Bosmer, as it will be known when the set gets released, because this is actually a Wood Elf in the art.
This is Skeletal Mage.
I think this is going to end up being a really solid card. I think
we can skip this. I basically just talked about Skeletal Mage again. This is the same mistake I made with Skeletal Mage, and then I thought Conscription Dagoth was going to be playable. Conscription Dagoth did not end up being, or not Conscription Dagoth, but some form of Control Dagoth would be playable. Did not end up being playable. This ends up being a 1-star card. Nobody really did anything with it. Definitely. It wasn't bad. It wasn't bad in the Dagoth, but again, Dagoth is just such a bad option as a control deck. I got locked in on Skeletal Mage, Imbued Altmer synergy, and forgot that Dagoth has no way to close out games. And those definitely helped with the defensive aspect of it, but you still couldn't close anything out.
Slinking Jackal is less impressive than its wily brother, but still pretty strong, I think. Still going to end up seeing a decent amount of play. I think the big issue here is you look at green 2-drops, and they're not that strong. You look at Mournhold Trader, and it's obviously fantastic, but then you're looking at stuff like Surin Pawnbroker, which is not that good to come down on 2, Awakened Dreamer, which is not that good to come down on 2, and this is just stronger leading than those. This fights both a Mournhold Trader and a Mammoth, which those do not do, although this does have 2 health, which is obviously a downside, so this does get eaten alive by Wardcrafter. There is less of a downside compared to something like the Minotaur, where it's 3 mana, 5/2. This is... Yeah, a Wardcrafter is going to eat a 2-drop occasionally. That doesn't necessarily mean that every 2-drop that has 2 health is unplayable, and I think there's enough upside on this for very aggressive green decks, which is kind of a direction green already wants to go, that I think this will end up being solid. I think this will end up seeing play not in Halalo. I don't think it's going to make the cut there, but in some lower decks that are in potentially tier 2 or 3, so we're going to call this a 3-star card. The Sassy Paw, I like that. This is close. This is between a 3 and a 4, depending on what you want to call Aggro Assassin. It is a staple in Aggro Assassin. Aggro Assassin for most of the expansion, I think, was definitively in tier 3. It is starting to come up, be seen a lot more consistently now. So I think you can make an argument on this being either a 3 or 4-star card. We'll call it a 3 just because most of the expansion, Aggro Assassin wasn't really seen, but it's close. You could really call it whatever you want to do. It's kind of splitting hairs. However good you think Aggro Assassin is, that's how good Slinking Jackal is, because that's the place where it really stuck. You saw it in some other places, like if anybody was playing Aggro Archer, they would play Slinking Jackal, but I mean, most of those decks just didn't do that much in the meta. The big one was Assassin. So yeah, Slinking Jackal's a pretty solid card. Not as good as Wily Kiva, but
very solid and found a home.
Suthe Bootlegger is solid. Needs some support to be offensive, and that's the problem because the effect is a very offensive sort of effect, but it really needs support to make its stat line better. And for a 2-mana card, I think you just need to do better than need support to make your stat line better. So I don't think this is going to end up being quite good. Something to consider is this is a 2-drop off of Conscription that has a high guard total. I don't think you need that, but it is something to think about. But yeah, I don't think this is a particularly strong card. I think the effect and the stat line are opposed to each other. So I'm going to call this one a 1-star. I really don't think it's going to see play anywhere.
Card sucks, 1-star. There's a lot of 1/5s in this game that aren't very good. Maybe if they introduce Magnetize, they'll be better. But card's bad.
10-hour Zelvite Night Stalker is very much just a meme. For one less stat on the 2-mana 2/4, you don't have to kill yourself at the start of the turn. This is obviously
So
a card
bad.
that's best played on 2, but you can't play it on 2 because it will just kill itself. So not a particularly strong card. I don't think it's going to end up making any lists. I think the downside of, it killing itself is a pretty high downside. So kind of flavorful, but not gonna make the cut. This is a 1-star card.
Yeah, it turns out killing yourself is really bad. I mean, at least Falling Wizard gives you a scroll. Right? This guy doesn't even have the decency to give you a scroll when he kills himself. Come on, man.
Moonphase Suthe deserves some extra looks because I think when you look at the Wax and Wane cards, the ones that have draw are the most interesting because of the fact that draw is the most timing independent effect given out of all of these. So you would just take the draw when you get it, and if you don't need the draw, then you just play it as a 3-mana 3/3 drain, and that's fine. That still scales pretty well. Drain scales very well as a keyword into the late game. I just don't think it's good enough. I think it's good, not great, and I think stuff that is not great will really struggle to find play right now because this is a control card, and control just has so many better options, I think, in terms of trying to draw cards. Telvanni has stuff like Telvanni Cat's Paw. You have Endoral Mastermind, which if you want to draw is more consistent than this card.
It's better than Mastermind.
You have Thieves Guild Shadowfoot, which again is more consistent.
I don't know if it's better than Shadowfoot
in drawing,
but
so I don't think it's going to make it. I think even though it can be brought back by Necromancer, it's only drawing on half of turns, and you don't really want to bring back a 3/3 ward from Necromancer. So just not really I don't think this cracks the list. I think Telvanni is just too good, has too many good options to make the list, and I don't see any other situation where you would want this unless Necromancer was relevant. So gonna call this one a 2-star card. I think it'll see some play as people experiment with Wax and Wane cards, but it will eventually be moved on from.
who the fuck plays Catspaw? That's the point. It's better than Catspaw, or Catspaw is better than this in that situation. But I was over-focused on Telvanni. I was over-focused on Control Green. Where I'd missed was the Wax Swain Monk. I did talk about it with Elfiq Illusionist, where I thought there was potential, but I didn't think that deck was going to make it. That deck did end up making it. Moonphase Suthe is a pretty solid card in that deck, so it ends up being a 3-star card. Didn't really crack any other lists. Didn't really crack any Telvanni lists, although you'll still see it occasionally. But because of its presence in the tier 3 deck that is Wax Swain Monk, it is a 3-star card.
I disagree with a lot of people who suggested this is a worse card than Ash Oppressor. I still think this might actually just be better than Ash Oppressor.
I still think
the
this is
condition
better
is
than
actually
Ash Oppressor.
meetable. On turn 4, I think Ash Oppressor is almost never meeting its condition on turn 3, which is the big issue with the card. So I think this is actually better than people expect, but I still don't think it's going to be good enough. Green 4-drops suck, so maybe in aggressive stuff you see this, because Shackle's good, and statted offensively is good, but 4-mana 4/3 is just kind of too low. This is a lot closer than people think, but I don't think it's going to be close enough. I think people are going to try it out a little bit once they kind of play it a couple times to see that it's a powerful card. Similar to Icewind Dragon, which I think is a powerful card that just isn't good enough. I think this is about the same power level as Icewind Dragon, so I think this will end up being a 2-star card. But maybe I'm wrong. This could end up being really good. I genuinely think there's something behind this card compared to what most people are saying.
I still think that. I still think this is a really solid card. Definitely one to watch in the future. One of many cards we'll be talking about as we move into purple that watch this card when rotation happens, because I think this will be a very strong. Like, the power level's there on this card. It just doesn't have a place right now because the power level on everything is so freaking high. But it's not bad. You'll see it occasionally in Aggro Assassin, but not enough for me to give it a star. We're going to call it a 2-star card. I think it's really solid, though. It is a really, really solid card. Because turn 4, you'll almost always have something good to shackle or get something out of the shackle. And the stat line is obviously not great, but it's going to trade into a lot of decent stuff on turns 4 and 5. So watch this card in the future, but as for now, it's just a 2-star.
Mausoleum Delver. This is a very minor effect, which is why I don't think this is going to end up being good. This is a much worse effect than Candlehearth Brawler, which is the 4-mana 2/4/5 charge that sees play. Basically, the only time you could ever see this is if we are in such a Necromancer-heavy meta that stealing stuff like Sanctuary Pet and Territorial Viper becomes relevant. I don't think we're going into that kind of meta, although we will see plenty of Necromancers. I don't think it'll become such a big deal for aggro decks that they need to run this card. So, and obviously you don't want to run this in control. It just doesn't do a whole lot for you as a control deck. So I think this is just a really mediocre card, not going to really find a home anywhere. I'm going to call it a 1-star.
It does end up being a 1-star. I saw some really, really cheesy people running this as a counter to Alfeet Conjure. But it was so bad. It was so bad even in that situation, because you're playing like a 5-mana 2/5. Because it comes down after the Atronach. It was so bad. It's not a good card. This basically hit the perfect situation where there was something specific to be stolen from the grave in like 50% of decks, and it was still a 1-star card. It's still bad. We have reached the Rebellion General. This is the payoff for Wax and Wane, and as I have talked about before, I believe that Wax and Wane deck, the best versions of it, that utilize this card, utilize as many Waxes and Wanes that they will get value out of this card, I believe that will max out at tier 4. But because this is the card that will make it a deck at all, the fact that if this card did not exist, that deck would not exist, I will call it a 3-star card. I think this potentially has some minor utility if you manage to run just only 2 Wax and Wane cards, because this is a 4-mana 5/4/4/5 by itself. So if you're triggering 1 Wax or Wane, you are getting value out of this card. So maybe, and I think you could maybe see this in decks that aren't Wax and Wane because of that. Maybe just run a couple, but I don't think that the deck that centers around this will end up being very good. So we're going to call it a 3-star card. Again, I think it will be a tier 4 deck, the Wax and Wane deck, and this may see scattered play in some tier 3 decks. But I don't think the one that centers around Waxes and Wanes will be a good deck, I think. All right, so basically everything we talked about with Elfic Illusionist. Elfic Illusionist and this card tend to go hand in hand. This is a 4-star card, much like Elfic Illusionist, because it pushes the Wax and Wane Monkey deck to be tier 3. Without this card, that deck would not exist. So I understood what the deck was going to be, which was basically just spam Elfiques. I just did not believe it was going to be that strong before the expansion's release, and the rating reflects that, so we bump it up 1-star because it ended up being a little bit stronger than I assumed. Pretty much that's the only place you'll see it, is the Wax and Wane Monk. People tried it in a lot of different stuff, but not particularly strong. But yeah, this pushes a tier 3 deck, and by the rules of the ratings that I've set up, that is a 4-star card. Apex Predator is super interesting from a damage standpoint because this is just a huge amount of damage. The thing that makes me like Apex Predator is potentially a build for mid-range assassin, which I think could hit tier 3, is the fact that the move cards aren't bad. The fact that you're probably running some of the move cards incidentally anyway. Shadow Shift is a good card. Mad Dash is okay. Bewildering Speed is okay. Dune Smuggler is okay. You're already running cards that aren't crap. And especially in Assassin, where you can use Gnarled Rootbender to double up on those. Say you're using all of the move cards and you don't draw your Apex Predator, you can still get value out of them because you can use them to draw with the Gnarled Rootbender, or just use them to move and attack. So just pretty insane in the race. Ton of damage potential with move cards. I think this has a lot of potential as a build of mid-range Assassin. So I'm going to call this one a 3-star. I think the build involving this and Gnarled Rootbender, or really just this and any of the move cards. It doesn't have to be tied to Assassin. It could be something like Monk, even though I think Monk Strike isn't a great card for that. It could be something like Archer, which has been looking for a finisher for a while for its aggressive decks. This is just really powerful as a finisher because you're running some of those cards anyway, adding a couple more, and then adding this. Maybe that helps you get This
there.
isn't going to be as fun as you guys think. Apex Predator. Apex Predator is a between a 2 and a 3-star card. It's a little bit iffy to call it a 3-star. It's tough for me to say because I know a lot of other people have had success with it. My experiments with this card failed horribly. I couldn't get this thing to work. I couldn't get any deck involving this thing to work. But I know there's a lot of people who have. Is it enough to call it a 3-star? Probably not. But it's close. Call it a 2 or a 3. I'd probably call it a 2, but again, that might be personal bias just because my experiences with the card have been underwhelming. But it doesn't really matter.
Cartel Bruiser is pretty obvious pack filler. Needs to get 2 pilfers before it's okay.
Card's bad, 1-star. I'm not even going to pause the video.
Nothing to talk about here. This is a 1-star card. I think the stats on this are too low to be utilized in an effective way. The 5 mana 4/4 aspect of it. Obviously, it's a 5 mana 5/5, and your opponent can't target with actions. If there was just a 5 mana 5/5, your opponent can't target with actions. I don't think that would be good. Its Wane effect is in some ways worse than Soul Rest Marshal, which is already a card that is not very good. Even it wouldn't be that good even if it wasn't conditional. So I think this is kind of just 2 awkward effects. This does work relatively well together with the Moongate, but I think Moongate's going to be a bad card. I just don't think this is very good. I think this just too much of a downside as a 5 mana 5/5 that just ends up being vanilla most of the time. And with the Wane effect, you can do some interesting tempo things, but you're playing a 5 mana 4/4 for tempo, like to get like 2 more Magicka back and maybe play a little bit more. It just doesn't add up to me. I just don't think it's going to make it. I think, especially when you look at 5-drops where like stuff like Torval Extortionist doesn't see play, I don't think this is nearly good enough. You compare this to a card like Daedric Titan, which is another card that's relatively strong, but didn't even come close because of how powerful the 5-drop slot is and how powerful the 5-drop slot needs to be to see play. I don't think this is at that point, so I think it's going to see some experimentation but fall off as a 2-star card.
Corinth Brawler, if you want to go by the letter of the law in what I have put up as how to rate them, it's a 2-star card because it definitely saw some experimentation. I'm going to break my rules and call it a 1-star card because there is a fucking Wax and Wane Monk that actually exists from this expansion, and Corinth Brawler is so bad you don't even play it even though you're already running all of the support for it. This card sucks. This card is not good. So call it a 1-star, call it a 2-star, but I'll break my rules. I'm calling it a 1-star. I think this card's terrible.
So earlier I talked about Smash and Grab being one of the payoffs for something like Thieves' Den, as well as something like Master of Thieves, which already was a payoff for Thieves' Den. I said there was a third. This is that third. I think this card is tied to Thieves' Den as a card because Thieves' Den just kind of stacks onto this in a really interesting way that gives it just a huge amount of stats. Because of its cost, it costs 6. Because of its cost, I don't think you can combo this with any major pilfers versus something like the Khajiit, the Cat Hat, which can combo those pilfers immediately. If you're comboing this with a high-value pilfer, it's because that pilfer has already stuck alive. So you get to double trigger it, I guess, but you're already triggering that pilfer. And how many times do your pilfers actually live anyway? So I think in that instance it's bad. I think the fact that this is tied to the Thieves' Den deck, and I don't think the Thieves' Den is going to be good, and I think this isn't going to push the Thieves' Den deck, means I think this is going to end up being a 2-star card. I don't think it's very strong. I think the Pilfer deck is still a long way off because there's so many bad Pilfer cards that you have to play something that gives Global Pilfer to good cards to even consider this, and that's a 4-mana support that does nothing when you play it. So it's just a really hard sell for me, even with this card. As strong as it is, as strong as this can be with multiple Pilfers on board, those Pilfer cards are just so bad. I don't think this card's good enough to justify putting that many bad cards in your deck.
It's not. I thought I would see more experimentation because I thought it would take longer before people realized that this card was trash. It didn't even take them that long. Even like this card, because people just didn't craft it. People just found out, like the people who did play it were like, yeah, this card's trash, and then people just didn't craft it. Nobody ends up playing. We can do that at the end. But yeah, like I said, basically if you're getting good value out of this card, it's because your pilfers are already there. It's because your pilfers are already stuck and get a chance to attack. So it's like, what are you even doing? It's not good. It's really not good. It's a 1-star card. Didn't even see enough experimentation, I think, to push it to 2.
Whispering Claw Strike obviously costs way too much. Interesting effect, but no chance in hell you're paying 6 mana for this. This is just way too low value for that.
Yeah. Card scrap,
even if you get it off Prophecy, it's
not even worth pausing against.
This is disastrous. This is worse than like Dark Harvester if you have to play it from hand. So don't expect this to see play anywhere. Razumdar, I think, is potentially the most overrated card in the set. I think a 7 mana 4/3 charge, draw 2 cards would not be that good of a card, and I think this is worse than that. I think people underestimate how much worse it is to draw your opponent's cards than to draw your cards. Your cards are built around the deck that you built and they have synergy with them. Your opponent's cards are something completely random that has synergy with their cards, not with your cards. On top of that, this isn't necessarily draw 2. This is only drawing 2 if this is able to attack face and break a rune. So this is 7 mana 4/3 that has to go face, and your opponent needs to be within rune break range for it to get full value. Not feeling it. I just don't think this is a very strong card. I think there are better late game draw options than this card, and I think even the fact that this has charge kind of ruins it. I would much rather draw my own cards than to draw my opponent's. So I really think this is incredibly overrated. I think adding 2 mana to Cliff Racer means you need more than this, especially because you really scale up very quickly into 7 mana. 7 mana draw 2 isn't actually that strong, as crazy as it sounds. So I don't think this is going to end up being staple. I think this is going to end up being relatively mediocre. Fully prepared to be wrong about that, but I'm not a big fan of Razumdar.
Razumdar ends up being a 4-star card as a staple inclusion in a couple of tier 2 decks, that being aggressive Dagoth and aggressive Dominion. Turns out I was wrong. Ends up being good enough to draw your opponent's cards because it is, in the end, it is just gas. It is gas and also damage, and it's a lot of the times what most of these decks need on turn 7. Personally, my experiences with it, I haven't found it to be that good, but there are obviously a lot better players than me who have worked with it in these aggressive and mid-range decks. That, my opinion doesn't really matter on this stuff. It ended up being very solid for them. Ended up working very well for a lot of different people in a lot of tier 2 decks. So that's a 4-star card.
All right, we're going a little bit out of order with the purple cards because they were in a sort of weird way with Legends decks. So just the way I have them ordered is awkward. So that's why they're not in cost order. Moon Touched Guardian, Wax and Wane. Give a creature in your hand +2/+2 or Wane Guardian Ward. Obviously, the Wane is significantly better than the Wax, but I think the Wax is so bad that it's kind of dragging it down. The Wane isn't that good that you can afford to potentially have to play the Wax because hand buffing has just consistently in this game been proven to not be good. It's just so low tempo. And the Guardian Ward, I think, isn't particularly strong because of how many ping effects there are in the game and how many good ping effects there are in the game. So I think a 4-mana 3/3 Guard Ward just isn't a strong enough card to carry the Wax aspect of it. Although it is, you do get the Wane if you play it on 4. You don't get the Wane if you ring it out on 3, which is a big deal compared to something like Hive Defender or Emperor's Blade, where you'll ring those out very frequently. You can't ring this out on 3. That's a big deal as far as a defensive card goes, so I don't think this is going to make the cut. I think this will be experimented with and then fall off as a 2-star card.
Yeah, basically that. Got experimented with a little bit. Doesn't end up being that good. Hand buffing sucks. The Guardian Ward, if this was just 4-mana 3/3 Guard Ward, probably would have seen a decent amount of play. If this was a 4-mana 2/4 Guard Ward, it would have definitely seen play because of Necromancer. But as of current, just doesn't really see a whole lot of play. Again, Wax and Wane decks that were not Monk or Assassin got abandoned pretty much right away. This is maybe an exception because I think some people tried this in non-Wax and Wane decks just because the Guard Ward was pretty solid, so I'll give it a 2-star, but not particularly good.
Bone Armor is actually really fun to think about with
super fun card.
Ring of Imaginary Might decks, but those are very, very bad, and this is not going to push them to not being bad.
It did push them a little.
As a late-game combo card, some interesting stuff you could do with this, but there's just better combos that aren't Bone Armor. So I'm not seeing this as a particularly good card. I think it's worse than Enchanted Plate just about every way, and I'm going to give it 1 star.
Yeah, the only place it wasn't worse than Enchanted Plate was the Bone Armor Ring of Imaginary Might meme deck, which, let's be fair, did get significantly more powerful with the addition of Bone Armor because it became like a legitimate cheese deck. Not just one where it increased your high roll percentage by a lot. It's a deck you still have to high roll in, but it increased your chances to high roll by a lot. I still don't think that deck is particularly good, so I'm not really going to call it anything but a 2-star card, but let's be fair, it definitely made those Ring of Imaginary Might decks better, so 2-star card, better than I gave it credit for. Still not very good though.
Reanimate has some potential if we see the meta turn back to stuff like Parthenex loops or Sot the Seal. Obviously, this doesn't work with Sot the Seal, but big stuff. Big stuff, Soltaring it back and playing it again. If we see the meta go back to that point, then this will be good. I don't think we're going to see the meta go back to that point. I think we're going to stick to the conscription meta we have now. And if you're going to be playing big stuff, you're going to be playing it in a more proactive deck than something that wants to run a 9-mana action. So I think this is just way too slow for control styles, because I think control styles that are this slow want to go with the conscription style or the rage style instead, and this is not good with those. So I'm going to give this one a 2-star. I think people will definitely try it out because it has some interesting applications, but I don't think it's particularly good.
Yeah, it ends up being a really interesting card to play with, and definitely a card that can be put in at the end of a deck as a potential finisher and it's effective as a finisher. This is, again, we're going to do this a lot with purple cards. Is this one, keep an eye out after rotation, because once there's fewer late game options, this will be better. But basically exactly what I said. If you're going late game, you either want to be running conscription, or more realistically, you just want to be proactive and play a bunch of chunky creatures throughout the game rather than reanimate. So yeah, that's what it ended up being. We ended up having mostly a proactive mid-range meta, which meant reanimate didn't really have a place. So 2 stars. Scout actually.
Imbued Argonian, a 1-mana 1/3 with guard, and then has the imbued effect where if it gets consumed, it will give guard and +1/+1 to the creature. This is the one that might potentially make the early game consume curve cards actually be okay, because there are a decent number of them, and this is kind of the best hit off of them versus the imbued Bosmer, which is +1/+1, but it's +1/+1 and lethal, and you don't really care about lethal that early. Guard is much better for an early creature. Still, I don't think it's good enough. I think you need more out of a 1-drop for this, and the consume cards. Guys, the consume cards are really bad. The consume cards just did not end up being good enough, I think, to carry any of these imbued cards. Or the imbued cards did not end up being good enough to carry any of the consume cards. You could look at it either way. It's just kind of 2 mediocre cards leeching off of each other to be extra mediocre. So I don't think this is going to make the cut. I could be wrong about that, because 1-mana 1/3 is just fine. But I think you need more value out of a 1-drop. We got a 1-mana 1/5 that I called bad in this set. So a 1-mana 1/3 is probably not going to be good enough unless you're running a lot of consume synergy. And like I said, I think the consume synergy is pretty bad.
All right, so we're actually going to do lightning round. Spoiler alert, all of the consume-related cards are 2 stars because people tried consume and it didn't end up being good. That list, and I'm not even going to do these cards individually because I think they're all tied together, includes Seeker of the Black Arts, Nebanese Mercenary, and Ruined Shambler. Those 3 we're not even going to review. Those are also 2 stars. They were in the same vein as Imbued Argonian, as you played them in the consume deck, and the consume deck actually ended up being pretty fun, actually ended up being pretty solid, but not good enough to crack the meta, and something that basically is just going to be, you go back and try it after rotation after a lot of these powerful aggro cards have been rotated, because right now good stuff piles are just so much better than this. There's so many good powerful aggro cards that running synergy based stuff just isn't worth it when you can just run a pile of really strong cards and win the game probably more often. So Imbued Argonian, Seeker of the Black Arts, Nebanese Mercenary, and Ruined Shambler, all of those are 2-star cards. Personally, I would rate this a 3 because I think this has some control applications, but I think literally the only person who's done that is me, so I'm not even going to count it. There are 2 consume cards that we will talk about that I think kind of fall outside that, not necessarily have a different rating, but fall outside of this main consume deck that ended up forming, which are Dromothra, Reaper, and Boneweaver. We'll talk about those when they come up, but the other ones we're just going to skip because I think all of those together, the consume decks were fun. They were interesting. They were better than we thought they were going to be. You can win games with them. Didn't end up cracking the meta.
Arise is incredibly low value for 2 mana, even off Prophecy.
Fucking
Rise
Rise.
and Dead in each lane is just, this is 2 mana 2/2. It's just really bad. You have better than 2 mana 2/2 for Prophecy.
So bad.
There's better options than that, even with Guard. So you have like 2 mana 3/2 from Protector of the Innocent. This is just really, really bad. Not even close, so 1 star. Dromothra Reaper, I think, is worse than something like Broom of Profiteer or Dragontail Savior in just about every scenario for a control deck. I don't think you play this as an aggro deck because it will not be triggering on turn 2. And if it's not triggering on turn 2, a 2 mana 3/3 doesn't really matter that much. So I think this is pretty purely a control card, and I don't think there's a lot of control decks that will end up using this. There is potential here for a really interesting OTK involving Journey to Sovngarde and Ring of Namira, which I plan on trying quite a bit, and I think has some potential to actually not be a meme. But if I had to put my opinion down, and I do because this is a review, I don't think that will end up being that good. So I'm going to call this a 2-star card as one that gets experimented with, but will fall off in play.
Dromathra Reaper. Oh, I was so excited about the Journey combo. Journey combo ended up being bad. It's just, you have to get too deep into the deck, and when all the other control decks are being more proactive, you've already won the game by that point. After Ebonheart kind of went away, you didn't see so much of a need for these game-closing effects. It was more just about controlling people down, because it was more reasonable. When the decks were just running threats, it was more reasonable to just be a control deck. Whereas in the Ebonheart and Telvanni days, they were like gnats, so you couldn't let them stay around. You had to do something to kill them. There wasn't too much need for it anymore, and the deck itself, it just took too long to get going. Dromath Reaper, I still ended up playing in Veteran Conscription. Again, I'm not going to count that. Same as Imbued Argonian. I think I was just about the only person who was using this in control decks, and I did find it to be quite effective. It's sort of like I was already running Bruma. It was like a 4th and a 5th Bruma that worked a little bit differently. It healed 1 automatically, and it was a 3/3 in the late game. Occasionally, it would eat the Argonian. It was a solid enough card, but not really good enough to be consistently in any deck. So this one's also a 2-star, but it's a 2-star for a different reason than the other consume cards.
Expunge has a lot of text for a card that doesn't really do that much. I think it needs to do more than what it does right now to be good.
We did Nux.
That's
what
the
I
big
mean.
issue with it.
It wasn't good.
Heal and give immunity to Shackle is not enough to be worth 1 mana. You have 1 mana, draw a card, that's fine. 1 mana, heal a creature and give it immune to Shackle this turn. Would not see play. Healing Hands doesn't see play. It's 0 mana for heal. So I just don't think this is very good. I don't think this is better than, again, Enchanted Plate, which already doesn't see a whole lot of play. So not really feeling it. I don't think it's a particularly strong card. And yeah, not
Expunge ends up being a 2-star card, gets played in the Bone Armor deck, pretty much nowhere else. Every once in a while you'll see somebody play it in Control, specifically with something like Arrest, which is kind of funny, but not particularly good. 2 mana draw card's not good. So the deck that ended up playing it, again, the Bone Armor deck, utilized the heal aspect of it quite well. And that was kind of funny, but not a particularly good deck, so not a particularly strong card. 2 stars.
Much else. Servant of Jacques Khajiit has the problem that silence is an effect that you want it when you want it. It's not something that can kind of wait a turn if you don't actually have the ability to use it. This is also a 3-drop you can't ring out, which makes it worse than Mammoth in that respect. You have to play this on 3 to get the 4/4. And the silence aspect of it is obviously good. If there's a 3 mana 2/2 silence a creature, that would be good. But the fact that this only silences on every other turn means you can't rely on it as a silence. And if you can't rely on a silence, then you're not playing it. So I don't think this is going to end up making it. The raw power level of a 3 mana 2/2 silence is going to draw a lot of people into trying it out. So I think this will hit 2 stars, but I don't think it's going to be that good. Ruin Shambler has synergy with the 2 mana.
Fuck off, Ruin Shambler. Nobody cares about you. Jacques Khajiit is not that good. It's a 2-star card. Definitely people were trying it out in various mid-range decks. I saw a decent amount of it in Sorcerer to start off. But just not a particularly strong card. The upside's just not there to match the inconsistency. So being able to bring it off Necro is quite nice. But the fact that this is always, if it just didn't have the wax part of it, if it was just 3 mana 2/2 silence, it would be a really strong card because you could bring it back off Necromancer. But occasionally it's just bringing back a 3 mana 4/4, and who really cares, honestly?
Bone Weaver will very rarely draw a card, but I think potentially is just better than Phalanx Exemplar in any deck that would run that. So you look at something like a more aggressive or not aggressive, a more proactive control version of Veteran, similar to the Guildsworn and Crusader decks.
It's okay in that,
has
but
potential. I
that's
think
not
you would
good.
play Bone Weaver in that deck. As far as other control decks, I don't think you're going to see it make it there because I just think 5 mana 5/5 guard the stats need to be utilized in some proactive way. In those decks which maybe are closer to mid-range than control that kind of border, those are the decks that would really like this. Because when you look at Phalanx Exemplar play rate right now, you don't see a lot of decks that use Phalanx Exemplar that have purple besides sometimes Tribunal. And again, I think Veteran would end up being a good place for it. So Potentially Enraged Veteran, potentially in Tribunal, you'll see this see play. So I'm going to call it 3 stars because I think it's going to see scattered play in various tier 2 decks, as well as potentially very scattered play in a tier 1 deck. But I don't think it's quite as good as you might think when you first look at the text.
So this was actually kind of the reverse. It doesn't end up seeing probably enough play to call it a 4-star. But I think this is definitely a card that sees scattered play in tier 2 decks, being Telvanni and Tribunal. Tribunal's borderline tier 1, but this also doesn't see a ton of play in Tribunal. So I think this is a 3-star card. I think it's actually really strong. Like, I personally would rate this card higher than 3. I personally would play this over Phalanx Exemplar in pretty much every Tribunal list. I personally think this is a staple in Control Telvanni. I've been playing it in the Conscription Veteran where it's been very effective. I think this card is very, very strong. But in terms of how much I've seen it, it's mostly just been scattered play across various tier 2 decks, which by the definition of my rating system is a 3-star card.
Fallen Dragon would be a pretty hilarious meme if it wasn't just a giant middle finger to Cal Grunteed, because this is one of only
really
3
was.
non-unique dragons in the set, and this is obviously incredibly unplayable. This is a 5-minute. This is a tusked bristleback.
It really was.
Unless you're running a bad card to support it. So
it really was just a giant middle finger to fucking Cal Grunteed. Like, everybody was like, "Oh, I'm so excited to see what the non-unique dragons are in the set." We only got 3, and one of them was fucking Fallen Dragon. This card's 1-star. It's really bad. Got played in the Bone Armor deck. Was kind of funny in that, but
Zumag, as well as being one of the coolest names in the set, I think has a very particular home, and I think that home will be either tier 3 pushed by this card or potentially even tier 2. So I might be low on this rating. I'm going to give it 4 stars. I think this potentially brings back Orc Warrior. And it's weird to think about that because at first glance this looks like a control card, but I don't think this is a control card. I think when you think about the cards that utilize this best, you're looking at stuff like Withered Hand Cultist, Garnag, Haunting Spirit, Sower of Revenge, all of which are played in the mid-warrior deck that is currently around tier 3. So I think that plus the fact that it can use the summon effects of Eddie Orc, stuff like Stone Shard.
Right, I'd talk about that for a while. Yeah, this is right for the wrong reasons. I think it is a 4-star card because of its inclusion. Its frequent inclusion in a tier 1 deck, which is Tribunal, and its frequent inclusion in a tier 2 deck, which is Telvanni. Yeah, I think I ended up being way off. I thought this was going to be decent in aggressive lists because I thought this was basically going to be an Abner Tharn that had more synergy with a lot of stuff in Warrior. Turns out it didn't matter. Warrior still didn't end up being good enough. It wasn't even good in Warrior. I played it and I was just wrong. But definitely sees enough play in various Tribunal and Telvanni lists as just a second worse Abner that I think this is a 4-star card. Just had the wrong place for it. I fucked up. Okay, so there's a lot of editing fuck-ups in the next, 3 cards. First of all, Cadwell the Betrayer is on the screen for this one. I don't know why. I mean, I know why. The next one's Cadwell, and I fucked up the editing because I had added the second card so you could see both Cadwells. But it's on the screen. We're talking about Chimera here. We're not talking about Cadwell. I think he's just about to betray her, so.
Chimera is, unfortunately, one of the worst cards in the set. I think this card would be bad even if it read Pilfer, give all creatures in your deck +1/+1, because aggro decks that would want that effect don't have enough draw, and control decks that would want that effect would just run Praetorian Commander because then they don't have to rely on maybe I get a Pilfer D and attack in. So the fact that this is just Khajiit is kind of hilarious. I don't think this is anywhere even close to being good, even though it is a 5-mana 5/6. 5-mana stat line. There's just so many better 5-mana cards right now than something like this. So I don't think it's a particularly good card. I think this is going to be 1-star.
Yeah, Chimera sucks. There was a couple people, this is the ultimate Reddit card. Reddit was like, oh my god, Pilfermonk's going to be insane. This card is a joke. This card was a joke from the second it was revealed. It's really bad. It's a Cave Bear. The effect on it is so bad. It's so situational, and the type of deck that would want this effect can't afford for it to sometimes not happen. This card's terrible. It's a 1-star card. It was never not going to be terrible.
I don't even think Cadwell the Soul Shriven, as well as his buddy Cadwell the Betrayer. Immune to Shackle when a rune is destroyed. Cadwell the Soul Shriven gains +1/+0. And Cadwell the Betrayer.
I didn't think this card was actually that far off.
You can hit your own face. It's lovely. I think actually you play this in a neutral deck. I think the neutral decks are going to be bad, but a 1 mana 1/1 that sort of scales in a 4 mana 3/5 is like, okay, fine. For one card, in a neutral deck, you'll take that. But neutral decks aren't particularly good. I don't think you play this in any neutral splash decks, which are the ones that are good because you run only the good neutral cards there. So not a strong card. Kind of funny flavor, but interesting that they're continuing the double cards, but don't think it's very strong.
Yeah, ends up sucking. Like I said, you like it's actually okay if you play like straight up mono neutral for Centurion, but it's not even good enough to make the neutral splash, so therefore really has no impact on the meta. It's a 1-star card, cool flavor, kind of funny. Cool that they're gonna keep doing double cards past the Isle of Madness expansion, but not particularly good. All right, so visually I fucked the editing up on this one. You'll hear me say that this is a 1-star card and the next one is a 2-star card, but I flipped those, unfortunately, when I was editing, and I put the stars in afterwards. So ignore the bottom. I'm actually just going to cover it up there with other Ian, so you can't see it. Just listen to what I'm saying. I called this a 1-star card, and I called the next one a 2. I reversed the ratings when I was editing.
Lunar Sway is potentially playable in a Moongate deck, but I think I've talked enough about why I don't think Moongate is going to work. I think the big issue is that this is not playable in any other deck, and I don't think that deck is going to be anything higher than tier 4, and I don't think this is going to push that.
Do I trust that?
So because I don't even think that deck will see that much play, I'm going to call this a 1-star card. I don't even think it's an auto-include in that deck because drawing a 3/3 and a 4/4 isn't actually that good. So not really feeling this card. Don't think it's particularly strong, even in a Moongate deck, and I think the Moongate decks are going to be bad.
Yeah, it's not even good. And Moongate deck ended up being a thing. One Moongate deck in specific ended up being a thing, and this ends up not making the cut because it's just not very good. Just doesn't do what that deck wants to do. Just draw random little threats that you can play and they can answer. You'd rather just make threats with Elfique.
Speaking of which, here's Moongate. And I'm going to end up giving this one a 2-star card. I think it is significantly worse than the 4-mana Wax and Wane guy, so I think it's worth it to call this a weaker card, even if I call that one a 3-star, and I think they go together. So I think this is the big issue with Moongate is not that the Wax and Wane cards aren't potentially good, because there's a couple that are reasonable power level. The big issue is how much do you get out of getting both effects? In what cases is getting both effects good? There's only 3 cards that really jump out to me as good in that respect. That's the Pouncing Cinch, so 7 mana, 7/7 guard charge is good. There is the Elfique Illusionist, where the buff and then copying over to the other lane is good because the 2 effects complement each other. And then there's the Queen's Captain, because both effects are very, very strong. Aside from that, almost all of the effects are minor, so almost all of the effects from Waxes and Wanes are just relatively small, and you're playing... This is worth a card. Even though this costs 1 mana, it's worth the whatever the value of a card in your hand is that might have done something besides just sit there waiting for Waxes and Wanes to get played. So I think this is tied to having a lot of Waxes and Wanes in your deck, and I think most of those cards aren't particularly good, so I don't think this card is particularly good. I think this is tied to a deck that is going to be tier 4, and therefore this is a 2-star card. People experiment with it, and will certainly try as much as they can to make this sort of deck work, but I don't think this deck is going to be good, and I don't think Moongate is good enough to push it. So.
All right, so basically exactly the same. We talked about Rebellion General and Elfique Illusionist. It was a deck I recognized as a potential, and you could say I named off 2 of the key pieces there, which are Queen's Captain and Elfique Illusionist. I just didn't personally think that deck was going to end up being good. After getting my hands on the expansion, I felt like it was actually pretty strong, and then it ended up being played a decent amount towards the end of the expansion, to the point where we would call it tier 3. Since this is since I would put that deck in tier 3, this is actually a 4-star card, because this does push it. This card, Elfique Illusionist and Rebellion General, push that deck, and it's the only reason that exists. That gives it a 4. Again, I gave this a 2, not a 1. I fucked up the editing. I thought this would be experimented with and fall off. This was just an opinion on how strong I thought that Wax Wayne Monk deck was going to be. I knew it had potential, but I didn't think it was going to be quite good enough. I ended up being a little bit wrong on that. It ends up being a tier 3 deck, so Moongate is a 4-star card.
I think so. Crocodile Brute, I talked about a lot of the consume cards throughout, and I don't really think there's anything tying this whole consume archetype together, besides a little bit of lethal synergy within exactly Dagoth. So, don't really think Crocodile Brute's going to be that good. I think 2-mana 2/2 Prophecy is really, really bad. And you need to be running consume cards for this to draw a card. And I don't think you're going to be running a lot of those. The Black Worm Neophyte and the 4-mana 2/2, mass buff guy were the only ones I think were
Midnight Trespasser
really called
as well.
good. So I think there's just a lot wanting with the consume archetype. And the consume archetype needs to be good for this guy to see play, because otherwise he's very low power level. So I'm going to call it a 1-star card. I don't even think it's going to be experimented with enough.
It was experimented with enough. Consume decks played it. Consume decks didn't end up being good. It is a 2-star card because it did seem some experimentation. Like all of the consume cards, watch this card after rotation. I sound like a broken record here, but that's basically all you can really say about consume. And it's all we're going to say about the next card too, which is, we don't even need to watch this, but Ill-Fated Scholar is the same thing. It's a 2-star card. Watch all of the consume stuff after rotation, after some of the aggro staples get rotated out. But as of right now, there's no reason to play a synergy-based aggro deck when you can just play a pile of ridiculously powerful cards. All right, so when I initially did the review, I saved what I thought was the best for last. Maybe not the best, but one of the best for last, which was Euraxia.
Euraxia Tharn is...
Oh, one shout out. Rim Siege weapons I forgot to include in my initial review. I would have given that a 1-star, and it would have ended up as a 1-star. I might have given it a 2 just based on how much I thought people would play it. Rim Siege weapons, I just missed it somehow when I was doing my initial review, so apologize about that. But I didn't think it was going to end up being much of a card, and it didn't end up being much of a card.
The Spellsword class card, but more specifically, you get to play this card in Redoran, which I think is going to get a big buff in this expansion with the addition of stuff like Fear Totem and Mulamnir. You also get to play it in Empire and Tribunal, which are very, very good control archetypes. And I think this is just a very, very strong card in those archetypes. So even if your opponent does get the last gasp, this is still reasonable because it is a very high tempo play. You get to take the big tempo swing, and then they have to take time out of their hard-earned turns to take that tempo back, and then you can basically have the onus to have not a free turn, but a much freer turn than if you had not played your Axia Tharn. Then you get to the point where there's ways you could cheat this, and I'm not talking about stuff like Silence. I think Silence is probably not what you're looking at, except in exactly Tribunal with negation. But what you could be looking at is stuff like Blinking. Night to Remember is a card that is not that far off, especially now with the nerf of Namira's Shrine, from being a legitimate draw option. And Night to Remember loves this card. Fear Totem, the card that just got released for Redoran, loves this card. I think there's so much potential synergy, and even if you don't get that synergy, the value on this is high enough that this will be played in multiple Tier 1 decks and may push Redoran into being something like Tier 3, Tier 2. So I think this is going to be a 5-star card. I think this is one of the best cards in the set. I figured we'd end on a good note.
It did end up being one of the best cards in the set. Not as good as I thought it was going to be. I thought Empire was going to be a little bit more represented than it ended up being as far as conscription goes. But I think it kind of got distracted by people just playing aggro Empire instead. I mean, conscription decks sort of fell off as a whole, but I think that's still, you could call it a Tier 3 deck, and I think the big one is Tribunal, which is a Tier 1 deck. This is occasionally seen in Tribunal. In the slower versions, the hard removal style of Tribunal, you basically always see this card, but that I wouldn't say is higher than Tier 3, so occasionally seen in a Tier 1 deck, staple in a couple of Tier 3 decks. I think that means this is a 4-star card. This is definitely really solid. I overestimated what it could do for Redoran. I probably overestimated the power level a little bit as a whole, but it's still a very strong card. Still definitely one that you consider in a lot of different stuff, and it is very good tempo regardless of whether or not your opponent steals it back. It's a great way to close out games against aggro decks, because usually they have absolutely no answer to your Axia. Just an efficient card. So 4 out of 5, and it's the last one. So MDub asked if I could do expansion as a whole. We can actually get Oldian off the screen. Fuck Oldian. Expansion as a whole, compared to other expansions, probably one of my least favorite expansions, to be honest. Coming off of Alliance War, I actually really liked Alliance War as a whole. I don't think Alliance War did much for power level. Obviously, it was pretty much just the 3-color decks that it added. But I still think that was it was kind of fun. It was just enjoyed enjoyed experimenting with all the 3-color decks. The Alliance War meta was one of my favorites. And Moons of Elsweyr really wasn't. I kind of just stopped playing this game. I just wasn't having fun. There's only a couple decks that I really found fun because a lot of stuff was really samey after the release of All Fate Conjure. There wasn't a lot of good cards, so we ended up mostly just playing decks that existed before the expansion, plus All Fate Conjure and maybe 1 or 2 new cards. And I just didn't enjoy it. I didn't think it was particularly fun. I thought it was just basically the same meta as Alliance War, but a little bit worse and a little bit more samey. And I hope they release fewer cards centered around mechanics in the next one, because we had, out of all of the Consume and Wax and Wane cards and Pilfer cards, which were a huge percentage of the set, because the set was only like 80 cards, out of all of those, the only thing we got was one tier 3 deck. And that's just unfortunate, because that's what all of those cards were kind of meant to do, is try to push those archetypes. And it was fun to play it for a couple of days, but they didn't end up being anything. It didn't end up being anything particular in the meta, aside from exactly the Wax and Wane Monk, which isn't even that big of a force in the meta. It's just a tier 3 deck that people enjoy playing. So overall, was not a huge fan of Moons of Elsweyr. I would probably put it above Clockwork and Houses of Morrowind, which are my 2 least favorite expansions. But I just didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I enjoyed Alliance War. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Always fun to do these reviews of reviews. And I'm generally happy with the review for this one. The major misses were Razumdar, Wandering Skeleton, and Discerning Thief. I don't feel like I missed much on the Moongate, because I think generally with the Wax and Wane stuff, I recognized the power level of the Monk. I just didn't quite think it was going to make it, but it did end up making it, not by a whole lot. So generally pretty happy with the review as a whole, and looking forward to the next one.